Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I've been listening to police scanners for 18 years now, and in all that time, I've heard things that would give most people nightmares for weeks. It started back when I was 21, fresh out of college with a criminal justice degree and idealistic notions about making the world a better place. I thought listening to real police work would teach me more than any textbook ever could about law enforcement and human nature. What I didn't expect was how addictive it would become, how it would consume my evenings and weekends, or how it would eventually lead me to discover something that still keeps me awake at night. Something that made me question everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the thin boundary between them. Most scanner enthusiasts will tell you the same thing about this hobby. Once you start listening, you absolutely cannot stop. There's something almost hypnotic, almost narcotic about sitting in your living room late at night, headphones clamped over your ears, listening to the voices crackling through layers of static as officers deal with everything from routine traffic stops to domestic disputes to break-ins to fatal accidents. You learn the rhythms of the night shift, the call signs that become as familiar as your own name, the personalities behind the badge numbers and unit designations. You start to recognize individual officers by their voices, their speech patterns, their mannerisms, the way they handle different types of situations, even the subtle changes in their tone when they're dealing with something that's gotten under their skin. In my city of Millbrook, Michigan, a mid-sized community about 40 minutes northwest of Detroit, Dispatcher Sarah Martinez has been working the overnight shift for nearly 9 years. Her voice is calm and professional no matter what kind of chaos is unfolding across the airwaves. House fires, domestic violence calls, armed robberies, fatal car accidents. Nothing seems to rattle her. She speaks with the kind of steady competence that only comes from years of being the voice that officers depend on when their world is falling apart around them. Officer Rick Sanderson has this distinctive gravelly voice that cuts through radio interference like a knife through butter. He's a 23-year veteran who's seen everything this job has to offer and handles each call with the kind of weary, methodical competence that comes from having witnessed the full spectrum of human behavior, from the sublime to the absolutely horrific. There's Officer Danny Martinez, no relation to the dispatcher, who's been on the force for 15 years and has this habit of whistling softly when he's walking back to his patrol car after completing a call. Officer Nancy Walsh, one of only 3 female patrol officers in the department, who has this way of talking to upset civilians that can calm down even the most agitated domestic violence victim or hysterical witness to a crime. And then there's Officer Billy Crawford. Crawford is younger than the others, probably in his late 20s, and even after 5 years on the force, you can still hear something in his voice that the others have lost. A genuine belief that he's making a difference out there, that police work is more than just a job, that every call matters. Every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of their circumstances. He's the kind of cop who still takes every call seriously, who treats elderly complainants with patience and kindness, who goes out of his way to explain procedures to confused citizens, who actually seems to care about the people he serves. These voices have become the soundtrack to my evenings for nearly 2 decades. I know their speech patterns, their standard responses, their individual quirks and preferences. I know that Rick Sanderson always says 10-4, copy that, when acknowledging dispatch instructions, while Billy Crawford just says copy or understood. I know that Nancy Walsh has this slight accent that becomes more pronounced when she's dealing with something stressful. I know that Danny Martinez has a tendency to clear his throat before making important radio transmissions, especially when he's about to request backup or report something serious. Which is why what happened on that Tuesday night in November was so deeply disturbing, so fundamentally wrong in ways that I still struggle to articulate. Because when you've been listening to the same voices for years, when you know their patterns and personalities as well as you know your own family members, you notice immediately when something is off, when something doesn't fit the established rhythm, when someone is behaving in a way that's completely out of character. The call came through at exactly 11:47 p.m. on November 15th. I remember the precise timestamp because I had been recording everything that night, studying for a private investigator certification exam while using the scanner as a background noise. The familiar chatter of police radio serving as a kind of white noise that helped me concentrate on the material I was trying to memorize. I was sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by textbooks on surveillance techniques and evidence collection, when Sarah Martinez's voice cut through the static with the kind of routine call that normally wouldn't have caught my attention. Unit 247, we have a welfare check request at 1247 Oakmont Drive in the Willowbrook subdivision, reported by concerned neighbor. Caller states elderly female neighbor hasn't been seen in 3 days. Newspapers piling up on front porch. No response to repeated door knocking or telephone calls. Neighbor attempted contact multiple times over past 72 hours with no success. Welfare checks are absolutely routine in police work. The kind of call that officers handle multiple times per week without giving them much thought. Family members get worried when they can't reach an elderly relative. Neighbors notice when mail starts overflowing, or newspapers accumulate on front porches. Sometimes employers report when longtime workers don't show up for several days without calling in. 9 times out of 10, there's a perfectly innocent explanation. The person went to visit relatives in another state and forgot to mention it to anyone locally. They're sick in bed with the flu and too weak to get to the door. Their phone service got disconnected due to a billing error, or they're simply sleeping more heavily due to new medication and not hearing the doorbell. It's usually nothing more serious than a miscommunication or a minor medical issue. Unit 247 responding to 1247 Oakmont Drive. Estimated time of arrival 12 minutes. That was Officer Billy Crawford's voice, crisp and professional as always, carrying that note of quiet competence that had developed over his 5 years on the force. I'd been listening to his calls for the entire duration of his career, watching him evolve from an eager, sometimes over-eager rookie into a reliable, methodical patrol officer. He was the kind of cop who still took every call seriously, who treated each person with respect regardless of their social status or circumstances, who seemed to genuinely care about the welfare of the citizens he served. I turned back to my textbooks, but kept one ear tuned to the scanner. Something about welfare checks involving elderly residents always made me pay closer attention. Probably because my own grandmother had lived alone for 7 years before she passed away, and I remembered how worried our entire extended family would get when she didn't answer her phone for more than a day or two. There's something particularly heartbreaking about elderly people dying alone in their homes, undiscovered for days or weeks until someone finally thinks to check on them. It's one of those modern tragedies that speaks to how isolated and disconnected we've become as a society. 12 minutes later, exactly on schedule, Crawford's voice came back through the static. Unit 247 on scene at 1247 Oakmont Drive, confirming multiple newspapers on front porch, appears to be approximately 4 or 5 days worth based on publication dates. No lights visible in residence from front approach. No response to doorbell, loud knocking, or vocal attempts to make contact. Attempting to locate alternative entry points or sight lines for visual confirmation of occupant status. This was completely standard procedure for welfare checks. Officers are trained to be thorough but respectful of property rights. Try the front door first, check for lights or signs of activity, walk the perimeter of the property if necessary to look for any indication that someone inside might need medical assistance. Usually, this is exactly where these calls end. Either someone eventually answers and explains they've been under the weather, or dealing with family issues, or the officer has to start making phone calls to track down family members or property managers who might have spare keys. But 5 minutes passed without any follow-up transmission from Crawford. Then, 10 minutes. In police work, especially during welfare checks where the situation can change rapidly from routine to emergency, officers are trained to maintain regular contact with dispatch. Silence on the radio is rarely a good sign, particularly when an officer is investigating a potential medical emergency. When Crawford's voice finally crackled back over the radio, there was something fundamentally different about his tone. Not panic exactly, but a tension that hadn't been present in his initial report. A note of uncertainty that was completely out of character for someone who normally handled calls with quiet confidence. Unit 247 to dispatch. Go ahead, 247, Sarah Martinez responded immediately, her voice carrying that slight sharpening of attention that experienced dispatchers develop when they sense a routine call beginning to escalate. I've located an unlocked side gate leading to the rear yard of the property. From the back porch area, I have visual access into the kitchen through sliding glass doors. Dispatch, I need to report possible suspicious circumstances inside the residence. My attention snapped away from my textbooks immediately. I leaned forward and turned up the volume on my scanner. Suspicious circumstances during a welfare check usually meant one of two things: either a medical emergency that required immediate intervention, or something much worse. The change in Crawford's voice suggested he was seeing something that didn't fit the normal pattern of elderly person too sick to come to the door. Copy that, 247. Please describe in detail what you're observing. I can see clear signs of disturbance in what appears to be the kitchen area. There's a wooden chair overturned near the refrigerator, and various items are scattered on the floor. Looks like papers, maybe some kitchen utensils or small appliances. The rear sliding door is standing partially open, approximately 6 to 8 inches, which seems unusual given current weather conditions. It had been a particularly cold November in Michigan, with nighttime temperatures consistently dropping into the low 30s. Nobody leaves sliding doors open in that kind of weather unless something is seriously wrong. Either they're too incapacitated to close the door, or they left in a hurry under circumstances that didn't allow them to secure their home properly. Unit 247, do you require backup for entry and investigation? Negative for now. Dispatch? I'm going to attempt to get a clearer visual assessment through the open door. Property appears secure from external examination. No obvious signs of forced entry from the front or side approaches to the residence. This is where welfare checks can become legally and procedurally complicated. Officers have the authority to enter a residence without a warrant if they have reasonable cause to believe someone inside needs immediate medical assistance. But they also have to be extremely careful not to violate Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. It's a delicate balance between helping someone who might be dying alone and respecting constitutional rights to privacy and property. Unit 247. Be advised I'm dispatching Unit 156 for backup assistance. Estimated time of arrival, 15 minutes. Copy. Dispatch. Moving to rear of property for closer visual assessment. Through my scanner, I could hear Crawford's footsteps in the background of his transmission, the distinctive crunch of dead leaves and gravel that comes with late autumn in Michigan. November is when everything starts dying, when trees drop their leaves in thick, rustling carpets that make it impossible to walk quietly. When the constant sound of footsteps on decaying vegetation serves as a reminder that winter is approaching, and the natural world is preparing for its annual death and dormancy. Dispatch. I have a clear sight line into the residence through the partially open sliding door. I can see into what appears to be a living room area beyond the kitchen. There are definite signs of furniture disturbance. I can observe what looks like a coffee table that's been overturned, and there appear to be various objects on the floor that should normally be arranged on surfaces. Sarah Martinez's voice came back immediately, carrying the kind of controlled urgency that veteran dispatchers use when they sense a situation escalating beyond routine parameters. Unit 247, maintain your current position and do not enter the residence until backup arrives. Continue observation and report any changes in the situation immediately. But Crawford was already moving closer to the house. You could hear it clearly in the background. His breathing had become slightly elevated, and there was the unmistakable sound of footsteps on what was probably a wooden deck or concrete patio. Dispatch, I'm detecting audio from inside the residence. Sounds like it might be a radio or television playing somewhere deeper in the house, possibly the living room area. Also becoming aware of a distinct odor that I can detect even from my current position outside the structure. Every experienced scanner listener knows that when a police officer mentions detecting an odor during a welfare check, it's usually not good news. It could indicate a gas leak that's rendered the occupant unconscious. Spoiled food suggesting someone has been incapacitated for an extended period. Or something much worse. The unmistakable smell of human decomposition that occurs when someone has died alone and remained undiscovered for days or weeks. 247. Can you characterize the nature of the odor you're detecting? There was a pause before Crawford responded, and when he did, his voice carried a note of grim certainty that made my skin crawl. Dispatch, based on my training and experience, I believe the odor is consistent with human decomposition. Requesting coroner response and detective unit for possible deceased person investigation. The smell is definitely organic in nature and suggests the presence of a body that's been deceased for several days. But here's where the call took a turn that still gives me chills whenever I think about it, where everything I thought I understood about routine police work was turned completely upside down. What happened next defied every protocol, every bit of training, every logical explanation I could think of. Unit 247, did you say you're hearing a radio or television playing inside the residence? There was a pause before Crawford responded, and when he did, his voice carried a note of confusion that was completely uncharacteristic for someone who normally handled calls with methodical confidence. Affirmative, dispatch. The audio appears to be coming from deeper in the house, possibly the living room or family room area. But now that I'm listening more carefully and paying closer attention to the specific characteristics of the sound, it doesn't quite match the pattern of radio or television programming. 247, please clarify what you mean. Dispatch? What I'm hearing sounds more like... It sounds like multiple people having a conversation. Like there are several individuals inside the residence engaged in normal social interaction. The radio went completely silent for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. When Sarah Martinez came back on the air, her voice had taken on the sharp, focused edge she used for potentially dangerous situations, the tone that told every officer listening that something was seriously wrong. Unit 247, are you saying there are people inside the residence engaged in conversation? Negative, dispatch. I don't believe there are living people inside. The decomposition odor I'm detecting is definitely consistent with a deceased person, possibly deceased for several days based on the intensity. But I can clearly and distinctly hear what sounds like multiple voices engaged in normal conversation. 247. Describe the voices you're hearing in as much detail as possible. Multiple speakers. I can distinguish what sounds like both male and female voices from my current position. The conversation sounds completely normal and natural, like people discussing everyday topics or social situations. I cannot make out specific words or phrases from my current distance, but the rhythm and cadence are consistent with normal human speech patterns. The volume varies significantly. Sometimes it's loud enough that it sounds like the speakers are in the room immediately adjacent to where I'm positioned. Other times it becomes much quieter, almost like they're moving to different areas of the house. This was completely outside the realm of normal police work, completely beyond anything I had heard in 18 years of scanner listening. I'd monitored officers dealing with everything from domestic violence to armed robberies to fatal accidents, but I'd never heard anything remotely like what Crawford was describing. His voice carried a note of genuine bewilderment, like he was trying to reconcile what he was experiencing with his training, his common sense, and his understanding of how the world was supposed to work. Unit 247. Backup is approximately 2 minutes out. You are ordered to maintain your current position and do not enter the residence until Officer Reeves arrives on scene. But Crawford wasn't listening to dispatch anymore. You could hear him moving again, his equipment jingling softly as he walked, the sound of his footsteps changing as he moved from gravel to what sounded like wooden decking. I'm just going to position myself for a better visual assessment through the sliding door. If there are people inside who might be in medical distress or in need of immediate assistance, I need to assess the situation more thoroughly. The decomposition odor could potentially be from a pet or spoiled food rather than human remains. Unit 247. You are specifically ordered to return to your current position and wait for backup assistance. Dispatch. I have a clear visual into the living room now. The furniture is definitely disturbed. I can see multiple chairs overturned, papers and personal objects scattered across the floor, clear signs of some kind of struggle or significant disturbance. However, I still don't see any people, either living or deceased. But the voices are definitely coming from inside this room, and they're much clearer now. That's when the radio interference started. At first, it was just minor static, the kind of atmospheric interference you get during certain weather conditions that can affect radio transmission quality. But it deteriorated rapidly, quickly escalating into the kind of severe interference that makes communication nearly impossible. 247. You're breaking up badly. Repeat your last transmission. Crawford's voice came through in fragments, broken up by bursts of static so severe that it was difficult to understand what he was trying to communicate. Can see the entire living room area. No bodies visible, but the smell is definitely stronger from this position. Voices they're getting significantly louder, and I can almost make out. The static was so severe now that Sarah Martinez had to ask him to repeat himself multiple times, her voice beginning to carry the kind of stress that dispatchers develop when they lose contact with officers in potentially dangerous situations. Unit 247. Backup is arriving on scene now. Exit the residence immediately and return to your vehicle. Dispatch. Can't. The voices. They're talking about. They know. And then nothing. Complete radio silence for about 45 seconds, which is an absolute eternity in police communications. When dispatch loses contact with an officer, especially during a situation that's already been classified as suspicious, every second feels like an hour. Unit 247, please respond immediately. Billy, are you there? Can you hear me? Sarah Martinez had broken protocol by using his first name, which told me she was genuinely worried about his safety. Dispatchers are trained to maintain professional distance and stick to call signs and formal procedures even under extreme stress. When they start using personal names, it means they think something has gone seriously wrong, and normal protocols aren't adequate for the situation. When Crawford's voice finally came back over the radio, it was completely different. The confusion and tension were gone, replaced by a flat, emotionless tone that sounded like he was reading from a prepared script or reciting information he had memorized but didn't really understand. Unit 247 to dispatch. I'm fine, sorry for the radio difficulties. I'm inside the residence now and have located the source of the decomposition odor. Billy, you were specifically ordered not to enter the residence. What is your current status and condition? I've found a deceased elderly female in the master bedroom. Appears to be natural causes, possibly been deceased for 5 or 6 days based on the state of decomposition and environmental factors. No obvious signs of foul play, violence, or forced entry. Scene appears secure and stable. What about the voices you reported hearing throughout the investigation? There was a pause that lasted just long enough to be noticeable. Just long enough to suggest that Crawford was thinking about how to respond rather than simply answering a straightforward question. What voices, dispatch? Unit 247, you clearly and repeatedly reported hearing multiple people having conversations inside the residence. What was the source of those sounds? Negative, dispatch. I reported no voices during this investigation. Any sounds I may have mentioned were probably audio from neighboring properties. These older houses sometimes carry sound in unexpected ways, especially when windows and doors are open to outside air. I'm going to secure the scene and wait for the coroner and investigative units. But I had been recording everything on my digital scanner, as I did every night. I immediately rewound the recording and played back Crawford's earlier transmissions. He had definitely, clearly, unmistakably reported hearing multiple voices engaged in conversation. He had described them in considerable detail, mentioned how they got louder and quieter, how they seemed to be coming from inside the living room, how the volume and location seemed to change, as if the speakers were moving around the house. Unit 156 on scene, came a new voice over the radio. Officer Dan Reeves, Crawford's backup, arriving exactly as scheduled. Copy 156. Unit 247 is inside the residence conducting preliminary investigation of a deceased elderly female. Appears to be natural causes. No signs of foul play or criminal activity. Here's the thing that really bothered me about this entire situation. The detail that made me realize something was fundamentally wrong with what I was hearing. I could hear Officer Reeves's radio transmission clearly from my scanner, which meant his patrol car was positioned close enough to the house that ambient sound would carry to his radio microphone. And in the background of his transmission, just for a few seconds, you could distinctly hear something else. Voices. Multiple voices, like people having a conversation. The exact same sounds Crawford had reported, then completely denied hearing. Unit 156 to 247, I'm at the front door of the residence. Are you ready for me to come in and assist with the scene? Negative, 156. Scene is secure and under my control. I'll meet you outside in a few minutes to brief you on what I've found and observed. Crawford emerged from the house about 5 minutes later. I could hear their conversation clearly because they were standing close enough to Reeves's patrol car that his radio system picked up their voices as ambient sound. "So, what's the story in there?" Reeves asked, his voice carrying the casual tone that cops use when debriefing routine calls. Elderly woman, probably Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, based on the mail and personal effects I observed throughout the house. Looks like she died peacefully in her sleep, maybe a week ago. Natural causes, from what I can observe. No obvious signs of trauma, forced entry, or foul play. Dispatch mentioned you reported hearing voices inside the house during your initial investigation. Must have been audio from one of the neighboring properties, Crawford replied. But there was something in his voice that sounded forced, like he was trying to convince himself as much as Reeves. You know how it is with these older houses, especially when doors and windows are open. Sound carries in strange ways, bounces off surfaces, creates echoes that can be confusing. I thought I heard something initially, but it was probably just a television or radio from next door carrying through the air. But Reeves wasn't entirely convinced by the explanation. I could hear the skepticism in his voice when he responded. Billy, you sounded pretty shaken up on the radio earlier. More than just confused about some ambient noise. You sure everything's okay? You've been acting a little off lately, and some of the guys have been talking. Everything's fine, Dan. You know how these calls can get to you sometimes, especially the welfare checks. Finding elderly people who died alone, nobody checking on them for days or weeks, sometimes longer. Makes you think about your own grandparents, your own mortality, what it means to die alone and forgotten. Sometimes your mind plays tricks on you when you're dealing with that kind of emotional weight. They continued talking for another 10 or 15 minutes about securing the scene, contacting the coroner's office, notifying next of kin, arranging for the house to be locked up and secured until the investigation was complete. Standard post-incident procedure, nothing unusual or remarkable about any of it. Both officers cleared the scene around 1:30 a.m., leaving yellow crime scene tape across the front door and an official notice posted for the coroner's office. But that's nowhere near where this story ends. In fact, what happened next is the real reason I'm telling you about this case, because it opened my eyes to something that had been going on for years without anyone noticing the pattern. Something that made me question everything I thought I understood about life, death, and the boundaries between them. See, I live about 4 miles from Oakmont Drive, in a neighborhood called Cedar Heights that's similar in age and demographics but slightly newer construction. And I've always been a chronic insomniac and natural night owl, so I'm usually up until 3 or 4 in the morning anyway, reading or working on projects or just listening to scanner traffic. Around 2:15 a.m. that night, I made a decision that probably sounds morbid or ghoulish, but felt completely natural and reasonable at the time. I decided to drive by 1247 Oakmont Drive to see the location where this strange and unsettling call had occurred. When you listen to scanner traffic as intensively as I do, you start to feel emotionally connected to these places and events. You want to see where things happened, to make the voices and radio calls more real and tangible, to complete the picture of what you've been hearing through layers of static and electronic interference. It's not voyeuristic curiosity, exactly. It's more like wanting to understand the full context of what you've been experiencing secondhand, to connect the audio you've been monitoring with the physical reality where these events actually took place. 1247 Oakmont Drive turned out to be a modest, single-story ranch house in a neighborhood that had clearly been built sometime in the early to mid-1960s. Nothing particularly remarkable or distinctive about the architecture. Basic suburban construction, well-maintained but showing its age, small front yard with mature oak and maple trees that cast deep, complex shadows in the moonlight. Crawford's patrol car was long gone, of course, but I could see the yellow crime scene tape stretched across the front door and the official coroner's notice that had been posted on the front window. I parked across the street and just sat there for several minutes, looking at the house and thinking about Mrs. Dorothy Henderson. trying to imagine what her last days must have been like, alone in that house, possibly knowing she was dying but unable to call for help or contact anyone who might assist her. It's one of the aspects of welfare checks that always affects me deeply. By the time we find them, it's always too late to actually help the person who needed assistance. That's when I heard them. Voices. Multiple voices, coming from inside the house. At first, I thought I must be imagining things, or maybe it was audio from one of the neighboring houses. Sound does carry strangely at night, especially in these older neighborhoods where the houses are built relatively close together, and audio can bounce off surfaces in unexpected ways, creating echoes and distortions that can be confusing. But the more I listened, the more certain I became that the voices were definitely coming from 1247 Oakmont Drive, from inside the house where Mrs. Henderson had been found dead just a few hours earlier. I rolled down all 4 windows of my car to hear more clearly, straining to make sense of what I was experiencing. There were definitely multiple voices, and they sounded exactly like people having completely normal conversations. I couldn't make out specific words or phrases, but the rhythm and cadence were unmistakable. Someone speaking, then another voice responding, occasional laughter, the natural flow and interaction of human social conversation. Laughter, coming from a house where an elderly woman had died alone and remained undiscovered for nearly a week. I sat there for maybe 25 minutes, listening to these impossible voices, trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. Maybe the neighbors really did have their television turned up loud enough to carry through the walls. Maybe there was some kind of electronic device or security system in the house that was still running, playing back recorded conversations or pre-programmed audio. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me after listening to Crawford's bizarre radio transmissions and letting my imagination run wild. But deep down, in a part of my mind that I didn't want to acknowledge, I knew what I was hearing was real, and it was definitely coming from inside that house. I pulled out my cell phone and called the non-emergency police dispatch number. County Dispatch, this is Sarah. Hi, this is Mike Thompson. I'm a regular scanner listener, and I'm currently parked outside 1247 Oakmont Drive where you had the welfare check earlier tonight. I think there might be people inside the house. Sir, that residence has been secured as a crime scene pending coroner investigation. There should not be anyone inside except the deceased, and she's been there for several days. I understand that, ma'am, but I can definitely hear voices coming from inside the house. Multiple people talking, like they're having normal conversations. There was a pause while Sarah processed this information. I could hear her typing on her computer, probably pulling up the incident report to refresh her memory about the details. Can you describe what you're hearing, more specifically? It sounds like maybe 3 or 4 people having regular discussions. I can't make out individual words or understand what they're talking about, but it's definitely human voices, definitely coming from inside that house. The conversations sound normal and natural, like people just talking about everyday things. We'll send a unit to check it out immediately. Please remain in your vehicle until the officer arrives, and do not approach the house or attempt to make contact with anyone inside under any circumstances. Unit 156, Officer Dan Reeves, was back on scene within 8 minutes. I watched him get out of his patrol car and approach the house methodically, flashlight in hand, carefully checking the perimeter to make sure all the doors and windows were still secured exactly the way Crawford had left them after completing his investigation. Then he walked over to my car, and I could see he was taking this report seriously, rather than dismissing it as the imagination of an over-enthusiastic scanner listener. Reeves was clearly a veteran officer, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of calm, methodical competence that comes from 20 years of dealing with every type of situation imaginable. "You're the citizen who called dispatch about hearing voices in the house?" he asked, his tone professional but not dismissive. "Yes, sir. They were definitely coming from inside. Sounded like people having normal conversations. I need you to step out of your vehicle and show me exactly where you were positioned when you heard these sounds." I got out and pointed across the street toward the house. I was parked right here with all my windows down, and the voices were clearly coming from inside the house. Based on the direction and characteristics of the sound, it seemed like they were originating from the living room area. Reeves looked at the house thoughtfully, then back at me, clearly trying to assess whether I was a reliable witness or someone whose judgment might be impaired by substances or mental health issues. "Sir, I need to ask a few routine questions. Have you consumed any alcohol tonight? Are you taking any medications or other substances that might affect your perception or hearing?" "No, sir, nothing like that. I'm completely sober and alert. I've been home all evening studying for an exam. I know what I heard." He nodded, but I could tell he remained skeptical. "Well, I just completed a thorough examination of the entire perimeter of that house. All the doors and windows are still secured exactly as Officer Crawford left them. The crime scene tape is intact. There are no signs of unauthorized entry or disturbance, and I didn't hear any voices or sounds coming from inside during my inspection. They might have stopped when they heard your patrol car approaching the area. Earlier tonight, Officer Crawford reported that the voices he heard seemed to stop when he got too close to the house, then resume when he moved away." Reeves gave me a sharp, interested look. "How do you know the specific details of what Officer Crawford reported during his investigation?" "I was listening on my scanner. I heard the entire call from beginning to end, recorded the whole thing." "I see. Well, sir, I can absolutely assure you that house is empty except for the deceased, and she's certainly not having conversations with anyone. The scene is secure, there's no evidence of any unauthorized entry or disturbance, and there's no indication that anyone else has been in or around that property. But here's the thing that really bothered me about this entire interaction. While Reeves was standing there beside my car, talking to me in that patient, professional tone that experienced police officers use when they think they're dealing with someone whose mental state might be questionable, I could see the house clearly over his shoulder. And for just a few seconds, maybe 4 or 5 seconds total, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Light moving around inside the house. Not electric light from lamps or ceiling fixtures, which would have been impossible since the power had probably been shut off pending the coroner's investigation. This was something like a flashlight or candle flame, moving deliberately from room to room in a pattern that suggested someone was walking through the house carrying a light source. "Officer, there's a light inside the house right now." Reeves spun around immediately, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon as he focused intently on the house. We both stared at it for about 30 seconds, but the light was gone. "I don't see anything, sir." It was there, a moving light, like someone walking around inside with a flashlight or candle. "Mr. Thompson, I think maybe you should head home for the night. It's late, you've been listening to police calls for hours, and sometimes when we're tired or stressed, our minds can play tricks on us. I can absolutely assure you that house is secure and empty." He was polite but firm, using the tone that police officers employ when they want to end a conversation without being rude or confrontational. I wasn't going to convince him of what I had seen and heard, and I probably looked like just another scanner enthusiast who watched too many crime shows and had an overactive imagination. So I thanked him for his time and consideration and drove home. But I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Crawford's radio transmissions, the way his voice had changed so dramatically when he came back on the air after that period of radio silence, the way he had completely denied hearing voices, even though I had the entire conversation recorded on my digital scanner, and I couldn't stop thinking about that light moving through the house, or the voices I had heard as clearly as I could hear my own thoughts. The next day, I did what any rational person would do when faced with something they couldn't explain. I started researching. I wanted to know everything I could about 1247 Oakmont Drive, about Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, about the history of that house and that entire neighborhood. Public records showed that the property was owned by Dorothy May Henderson, age 78, widow. She had purchased the house in 1987 and had lived there alone since her husband Robert died of a heart attack 6 years earlier. They had no children, and Mrs. Henderson's only surviving family was a niece in California who visited maybe once a year and rarely maintained regular contact. She was exactly the kind of person who could die alone and not be discovered for days or weeks. Socially isolated, elderly, with minimal family connections and limited community involvement. But here's what I found particularly interesting and disturbing. Mrs. Henderson had called police twice in the month before her death to report what she described as unusual disturbances at her residence. Both times, responding officers found no evidence of break-ins, vandalism, burglary, or any other criminal activity. The incident reports described her as elderly homeowner, possibly experiencing confusion due to medication side effects or early-stage dementia symptoms. I went to the county courthouse and requested copies of the actual police reports from those two calls, paying the small fee for photocopies and spending most of my afternoon reading through the detailed documentation. What I found was absolutely fascinating and deeply disturbing. Mrs. Henderson had told officers that she was hearing voices in her house during the late-night hours. Multiple voices, like people having conversations in her living room and kitchen areas. She said the voices usually started around midnight and continued until 3 or 4 in the morning. According to her detailed statements to the responding officers, they sounded like normal people having normal conversations about everyday things. But when she would get up from bed to investigate the source of the sounds, no one was ever there. She had described the voices as becoming progressively clearer and more distinct over time. Initially, she could only hear vague murmuring, like people talking in another room with the door closed. But over several weeks, the conversations had become loud enough that she could sometimes make out individual words and phrases. The voices talked about weather, news events, memories from decades past, and sometimes they mentioned her by name. Officer Billy Crawford had responded to one of those calls about 3 weeks before Mrs. Henderson's death. According to his detailed report, he had conducted an extremely thorough search of the entire residence, including the basement, all closets, the attic access, every room where someone might conceivably hide. He found absolutely no evidence of intruders, no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone else had been in the house recently. He noted that Mrs. Henderson seemed confused and possibly suffering from auditory hallucinations related to social isolation and advancing age. But here's the detail that caught my attention and made my skin crawl. Crawford's report mentioned that while he was interviewing Mrs. Henderson in her kitchen, he thought he heard what might have been a television or radio playing in another part of the house. When he asked to investigate the source of the sound, Mrs. Henderson told him she didn't own a television and hadn't owned one for over 5 years, and her old radio had been broken for several months. Crawford had written it off as sound from neighboring properties carrying through walls or windows, and didn't investigate further. His report concluded with a recommendation that family members be contacted regarding possible assisted living arrangements, since Mrs. Henderson was clearly having difficulty distinguishing between reality and hallucinations. But now, having heard the same voices myself, I was beginning to wonder if Mrs. Henderson had been hallucinating at all. The second police report was even more intriguing. Mrs. Henderson had called again 2 weeks later, this time reporting that the voices were not only louder and clearer, but they were talking directly about her. They discussed her daily routines, her deceased husband, her lack of contact with family members, even specific details about her health problems and medications. The responding officer, Danny Martinez, had found the house empty except for Mrs. Henderson, but his report included a note that while he was interviewing her, he had heard unclear audio that might have been a television or radio from a neighboring property. When pressed for details, Martinez admitted he couldn't identify the specific source of the sound, and Mrs. Henderson insisted she had no electronic devices that could produce such audio. 2 different officers, 3 weeks apart, both hearing unexplained sounds while investigating Mrs. Henderson's reports of voices in her house. I couldn't get this case out of my mind. Every rational part of my brain told me there had to be a logical explanation. Old houses make strange noises. Sound carries in unexpected ways through walls and air ducts. Stress and fatigue can cause people to misinterpret normal environmental sounds as voices. But I had heard what I had heard, and I had seen that light moving through the house. So I did something I'd never done before in 18 years of scanner listening. I started actively investigating, rather than just passively monitoring. Instead of simply listening to police calls from the comfort of my living room, I began driving by 1247 Oakmont Drive every few nights to see if anything unusual was happening. Mrs. Henderson's body had been removed within 48 hours of discovery, and the house was being prepared for estate sale by her niece in California. During daylight hours, there was normal activity, cleaning crews removing personal belongings and disposing of items that couldn't be donated or sold, real estate agents showing the property to potential buyers, contractors making minor repairs to address issues that might affect the sale price. Nothing strange or unusual about any of that. But at night, especially after midnight, things were fundamentally different. The first time I noticed the pattern was about a week after the initial welfare check. I parked in my usual spot across the street around 12:30 a.m. and settled in to watch and listen. The house was dark and obviously empty, but around 1 a.m. I started hearing them again. Voices, multiple people having what sounded like completely normal, everyday conversations. This time, I was prepared. I had my phone set to record video, and I had brought a small digital audio recorder to capture any sounds I might hear. I got out of my car and walked closer to the house, trying to determine exactly where the voices were coming from and whether I could understand any specific words or phrases. They were definitely originating from inside the house, specifically from the living room area where Crawford had found the overturned furniture during his initial investigation. The conversation sounded natural and relaxed, like people discussing their day, making plans for the weekend, sharing stories about mutual friends or family members. But I couldn't make out specific words, no matter how close I got to the house. I walked up to the front window and peered through the glass, using my phone's flashlight to illuminate the interior. The room was dark, but in the ambient light from street lamps and my phone, I could see that the furniture had been put back in its proper place since the initial investigation. The couch was positioned against the wall where it belonged. The coffee table was centered in front of it. Chairs were arranged normally around the room, but I could still hear the voices, and they were definitely coming from that exact room. I pressed my ear to the window glass, trying to make out individual words or phrases. That's when something truly unsettling happened. The voices stopped. Not gradually, not like people finishing their conversations and moving on to other topics. They just stopped all at once, like someone had turned off a radio or television. I waited there for maybe 5 minutes, ear pressed against the cold glass, but the voices didn't resume. So I walked back to my car, and as soon as I got about 50 feet away from the house, I heard them start again. This pattern continued for the next hour and a half. Voices when I was at a distance, complete silence when I approached the house too closely. Like whatever was causing the sounds was aware of my presence and didn't want to be observed directly. I came back 3 more times over the next 2 weeks, always between midnight and 3 a.m., always following the same routine. Every single time, the exact same thing happened. Voices from inside the empty house, stopping abruptly when I got too close, resuming when I moved away to a safer distance. But the last time I went there, something was fundamentally different. Something that changed my understanding of what was happening and made me realize this was far more serious than I had initially believed. It was a Friday night, about 3 weeks after Mrs. Henderson's death. The house was scheduled to go on the market the following Monday, so this would probably be my last opportunity to investigate before new owners moved in, and I lost access to whatever phenomenon was occurring there. I parked in my usual spot around 12:45 a.m. and prepared to wait for the voices to start. Right on schedule, around 1:15 a.m., I began hearing the familiar sound of multiple conversations coming from inside the house. But this time, they were much louder than they had been during previous visits. And for the first time since this whole investigation started, I could actually make out some of the words being spoken. The conversations seemed to be about Mrs. Henderson herself. I heard her name mentioned several times, along with references to how long she had lived in the house, how she had died, how sad it was that no one had found her for so long. The voices sounded sympathetic and caring, like close friends or family members discussing someone they had known and loved. I grabbed my phone and started recording as I approached the house. Unlike previous visits, the voices continued even as I got closer to the building. I walked right up to the living room window and pressed my ear to the glass, and for the first time, I could hear distinct words and complete sentences. She was a good woman, Dorothy was. Didn't deserve to die alone like that. None of us deserved it, but it happens. Always happens eventually. The new people will be here soon. I heard it's going to be a young couple. They always start young, but they age fast in these houses. Been waiting so long for new neighbors. Dorothy was kind, though, never complained about the sounds we make. Not like some of the others. Remember Frank Morrison? Always shouting at us to be quiet. Frank learned to appreciate the company eventually. They all do. And then I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins and my heart pound so hard I could feel it in my throat. Someone's listening outside the window. He's been coming here for weeks, watching us, recording us. The voices had noticed me. They knew I was there, and they were talking directly about my presence, my investigation, my recordings. I stepped back from the window, heart hammering against my ribs, but the voices continued with perfect clarity. He can hear us now. First time anyone's heard us this clearly. Things are changing. Always changing when new people come. But this one's different. He understands what's happening. He's not afraid yet. But he will be. That's when I saw the light again. But this time it wasn't moving randomly through the house like someone searching for something. It was moving directly toward the window where I was standing, getting brighter and more focused as it approached. I backed away from the house but kept my phone recording. The light reached the window and stopped there, and in its glow, I could see something that made me drop my phone and run toward my car as fast as I could. A figure. Translucent and indistinct, but definitely human-shaped. Standing on the other side of the glass looking directly out at me. And then another figure joined the first one, and another, Within seconds there were 5 or 6 figures standing at the window, all of them looking out at me with what felt like intense curiosity. I couldn't make out their faces clearly. They seemed to shift and blur when I tried to focus on specific features, but they were definitely there. Definitely real. Definitely aware of my presence. The voices continued, but now they were clearer than ever, like the figures at the window were speaking directly to me. He sees us now. Can't pretend it's his imagination anymore. He knows we're here. Just like Dorothy knew. Just like they all know, eventually. Time to welcome him home. I grabbed my phone from where I'd dropped it in the grass and ran back to my car as fast as I could. As I drove away, I could see the figures still standing at the window in my rearview mirror, watching me leave. When I got home, I immediately tried to play back the recording I had made. I was shaking so badly I could barely work the controls on my phone, but I was desperate to have some kind of proof of what I had experienced. The video showed nothing but darkness. 43 minutes of recording, and all you could see was the black silhouette of a house with no lights, no movement, no figures at the window. The audio was even more frustrating. I could hear my own footsteps, my breathing, the ambient sounds of wind and distant traffic, but no voices, no conversations, no indication that anything unusual had been happening. Either my phone had experienced some kind of technical malfunction at exactly the wrong moment, or whatever was in that house had the ability to avoid being recorded by electronic devices. Given everything else I had experienced, I was starting to lean toward the latter explanation. I tried to put the whole thing behind me after that night. I told myself that the stress of listening to police scanners for so many years had finally gotten to me. That maybe I was starting to experience auditory and visual hallucinations brought on by sleep deprivation and too much caffeine. Maybe Officer Reeves had been right when he suggested that fatigue and stress can make your mind play tricks on you. But 3 days later, I was listening to my scanner when a call came through that made my skin crawl and my hands go numb. Unit 158, we have a welfare check request at 2156 Maple Street in the Brookside neighborhood. Caller reports elderly neighbor hasn't been seen in 2 days. Mail piling up in mailbox. No response to door knocking or telephone calls. Different address, different neighborhood, different officer responding. But something about the call felt uncomfortably familiar. The timing, the circumstances, the almost identical wording of the complaint. Unit 158 responding to 2156 Maple Street, ETA 8 minutes. I had never heard Officer Martinez's voice before, but he sounded competent and professional. I decided to follow this call closely, just to see if there were any similarities to what had happened at Mrs. Henderson's house. The welfare check proceeded exactly as I expected for the first 15 minutes. Officer Martinez arrived on scene, confirmed newspapers and mail piling up, no response at the front door, began checking the perimeter for signs of the homeowner or alternative ways to make contact. Then, Unit 158 to dispatch, I've located an unlocked side gate and have visual access into the residence through an open sliding door. There appears to be disturbed furniture inside the kitchen area. My hands went cold. The exact same scenario as Crawford's call. Copy 158. Describe what you're observing. Kitchen area shows signs of disturbance. Wooden chair overturned. Various items scattered on the floor, including papers and what appears to be kitchen utensils. The sliding door is standing open despite current weather conditions. I'm detecting an odor that's consistent with possible human decomposition. Unit 158, backup is en route. Do not enter the residence until assistance arrives. But then came the transmission that confirmed my worst fears. Dispatch. I'm hearing sounds from inside the residence, multiple voices, like people having a conversation. My scanner nearly slipped from my hands. It was happening again. Exactly the same pattern. 158. Describe the voices you're hearing. It sounds like normal conversation, multiple speakers, but I can't make out specific words from my current position outside the structure. The volume keeps changing, sometimes loud, sometimes quieter. And dispatch. The voices stopped when I approached the door, then resumed when I moved back. Unit 158, maintain your position and wait for backup. Copy, but the voices have resumed and they seem to be coming from the living room area beyond the kitchen. It's like there are several people inside having a normal discussion about everyday topics. Officer Martinez, a 12-year veteran with an exemplary record who had never shown any signs of confusion, stress, or poor judgment, entered the house despite specific orders to wait for backup. Unit 158 to dispatch. I'm inside the residence. I've located a deceased elderly male in the master bedroom. Appears to be natural causes. Maybe been here for 4 or 5 days, based on the state of decomposition and environmental factors. What about the voices you reported hearing throughout your investigation? The same pause I had heard in Crawford's transmission. The same moment of confusion or realization. What voices, dispatch? 158, you clearly reported hearing multiple people having conversations inside the residence. Negative, dispatch. I reported no voices during this investigation. Any sounds I may have mentioned were probably audio from neighboring properties. You know how these older houses can carry sound in unexpected ways. I'm going to secure the scene for the coroner and investigative units. I immediately drove to 2156 Maple Street, which was about 6 miles from Oakmont Drive. Similar neighborhood, similar architecture, similar demographics. I arrived just as the officers were completing their preliminary investigation and clearing the scene. And at 2:15 a.m., exactly 1 hour after the police left, I heard the voices starting inside the empty house where an elderly man had died alone. This couldn't be a coincidence. 2 identical welfare checks. 2 experienced officers hearing voices they later denied. 2 elderly people found dead in houses that somehow continued to host conversations among invisible speakers. I spent the next morning researching everything I could find about 2156 Maple Street and its deceased owner, Harold Carmichael. The pattern was disturbingly similar to Mrs. Henderson's case. Harold Carmichael, age 74, widower, had lived alone since his wife died of cancer 3 years earlier. No children, minimal family contact, few social connections. He had called police twice in recent weeks to report unusual sounds in his house at night. Specifically, voices having conversations in his living room when no one else was present. Both responding officers had found no evidence of intruders and had concluded that Mr. Carmichael was probably experiencing auditory hallucinations due to isolation, medication effects, or early-stage dementia. One of those responding officers had been Martinez, the same officer who later found Carmichael's body and heard voices he subsequently denied hearing. I started monitoring all welfare checks in our county, looking for similar patterns. What I discovered over the next month was deeply disturbing and suggested something far more widespread than just 2 isolated incidents. 1847 Oak Ridge Lane. Welfare check on elderly woman living alone. Officer reported hearing voices during investigation. Later denied it completely. Victim found deceased from apparent natural causes. 9:23. Pine Valley Road. Welfare check on elderly man. Officer reported unusual sounds resembling human conversation. Later claimed it was probably a radio from neighboring property. Victim found deceased. 1456 Sycamore Drive. Welfare check on elderly woman. Officer reported voices. Backup officer also heard them briefly. Both later insisted it was sound from neighboring properties. Victim found deceased. 3289 Elm Street. Welfare check on elderly man. Officer reported hearing what sounded like multiple people talking. Later said it was probably television audio carrying through walls. Victim found deceased. 2745 Birch Avenue. Welfare check on elderly woman. Officer reported voices. Later claimed radio interference caused confusion. Victim found deceased. The pattern was consistent across 9 different addresses over the past 8 months. Elderly people living alone, calling police about voices in their houses, found dead days later during welfare checks where responding officers heard the same voices, then denied hearing them. But the most disturbing discovery came when I started researching the histories of these properties. Mrs. Henderson's house at 1247 Oakmont Drive had been purchased in 1987 from the estate of Frank Morrison, an elderly man who had died alone in the house and wasn't discovered for 8 days. Mr. Carmichael's house at 2156 Maple Street had been purchased in 1994 from the estate of Rose Garrett, an elderly woman who had died alone and wasn't found for nearly 2 weeks. The house on Oak Ridge Lane had previously belonged to William Torres, elderly widower, died alone in 1999, body discovered after 9 days. The house on Pine Valley Road had been owned by Margaret Sullivan, elderly spinster, died alone in 2001, found after 6 days. Every single house had the same history. Elderly residents dying alone. Houses sold to other elderly people who eventually died alone. Cycle repeating for decades. I started going back further, using courthouse records, newspaper archives, and obituary databases. The pattern held consistently. Each of these houses had a documented history of elderly residents dying alone, going back to when the houses were originally built in the 1960s and early 1970s. And in every case where I could find family interviews or police reports, the deceased had complained about hearing voices in their houses before they died. It was like these houses were somehow attracting people who would die alone. Or like something in the houses was ensuring that residents would become isolated and die without anyone noticing for days or weeks. But there was something else. Something even more disturbing that I discovered when I dug deeper into the historical records. All of these neighborhoods had been built during the same period, between 1962 and 1968, when suburban development was expanding rapidly throughout our county. And all of them had been constructed on land that had previously been used for other purposes. I spent 3 days at the County Historical Society, going through old maps, property records, and city planning documents. What I found was absolutely chilling. Every single neighborhood where these welfare checks had occurred had been built on land that was previously a cemetery. Not active, well-maintained cemeteries that were relocated with proper protocols and respect for the deceased. These were abandoned burial grounds, forgotten cemeteries that had been sold to developers because the land was cheap and the legal obstacles were minimal. The Oakmont Drive development, where Mrs. Henderson had lived and died, had been built on the site of Shady Grove Cemetery, established in 1891 and abandoned in 1962. The Brookside neighborhood, where Harold Carmichael had lived and died, had been constructed on the former location of Peaceful Rest Cemetery, established in 1889 and closed in 1963. According to historical records I found buried in the city planning archives, these cemeteries had been used primarily for indigent burials, elderly people who died in the county poorhouse with no family to claim their bodies, transients who died alone, mental health patients, others who were buried in unmarked graves because no one could afford proper headstones or memorial services. When the land was sold to developers in the early 1960s, the companies were supposed to relocate all human remains to proper cemeteries before construction began. But I found newspaper articles from that period indicating that Budget constraints and schedule pressures forced most developers to cut corners. Shady Grove Development Corporation announced this week that due to financial limitations and construction deadlines, only marked graves will be relocated from the former cemetery site. Company spokesman Robert Hayes estimated that approximately 65% of burials were in unmarked graves, primarily containing the remains of elderly county residents who died without family. They had built entire neighborhoods directly on top of unmarked graves containing hundreds of elderly people who had died alone and unloved. But that wasn't the most disturbing discovery I made during my research. I found records indicating that similar developments had been built on former cemetery sites throughout the county during the same period. The 1960s had been a time of rapid suburban expansion, and developers had specifically targeted abandoned cemeteries because the land was cheap, centrally located, and the legal obstacles were minimal since most of the graves were unmarked and unclaimed. At least 15 different neighborhoods in our county had been built on former burial grounds, almost all of them containing unmarked graves of elderly people who had died alone in county institutions. And when I cross-referenced those locations with the addresses of recent welfare checks involving elderly residents, the correlation was undeniable and terrifying. Every single house where officers had reported hearing voices, every single address where elderly residents had complained about conversations in their homes, every single location where people had died alone after reporting supernatural disturbances. All of them were built on former cemetery sites. The dead were still there, buried under the foundations of houses, and somehow they were influencing the living, drawing elderly, isolated people to live in those houses, then gradually wearing them down until they died alone and joined the community of spirits that already existed there. It was a cycle that had been repeating for decades, and it was getting stronger with each iteration. When I tried to take this information to the police, they wouldn't listen to me. I called the non-emergency line and asked to speak to a detective about a pattern I had noticed in several recent deaths. The detective I spoke with was polite, but completely dismissive. "Sir, elderly people living alone sometimes experience auditory hallucinations due to medication interactions, social isolation, or early-stage dementia. This is well documented in medical and psychiatric literature. As for the officers hearing sounds during welfare checks, old houses make a lot of noise, and audio can carry from neighboring properties in unexpected ways. But these houses all have the same history. Decades of elderly people dying alone, all of them reporting voices before they died. And they're all built on former cemetery sites. Sir, that's purely coincidental. Elderly people die alone more often than anyone would like, but that's unfortunately common in our society. There's no supernatural explanation for normal, tragic circumstances. And the fact that some neighborhoods were built on former cemetery sites is irrelevant. Proper relocation procedures were followed according to city records. I tried approaching individual officers, including Crawford and Martinez, but got the same response. Everyone I talked to had a rational explanation. Hallucinations, coincidence, misinterpreted sounds, overactive imagination from someone who listened to too many police calls. But I knew what I had heard and seen, and I was becoming convinced that whatever was happening in these houses was getting stronger, more bold, more capable of influencing both the living and the dead. The evidence came 2 weeks later when I was monitoring scanner traffic and heard a call that made my blood run cold. Unit 203, we have a disturbance report at 1247 Oakmont Drive. Real estate agent reports that potential buyers heard voices coming from inside the house during a showing yesterday afternoon. Agent is requesting police response to ensure the property is secure. My hands started shaking. Mrs. Henderson's house had been sold 3 months earlier to a retired couple from out of state. I had assumed that new residents would somehow break the pattern, that whatever was causing these phenomena would be disrupted by people who weren't elderly and isolated. Unit 203, responding to 1247 Oakmont Drive. I immediately grabbed my keys and drove to Oakmont Drive as fast as I could without breaking traffic laws. When I arrived, I recognized the patrol car in the driveway. It belonged to Officer Billy Crawford, the same officer who had found Mrs. Henderson's body and heard voices he later denied hearing. I parked across the street and watched as Crawford spent about 20 minutes inside the house, then emerged to talk with an elderly couple who were standing in the driveway looking upset and frightened. The couple appeared to be in their 70s, and their body language suggested they were genuinely disturbed by something that had happened. After Crawford left, I walked up to the couple as they stood beside their car, clearly debating whether to go back inside their house or drive away to stay somewhere else for the night. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound casual and neighborly rather than intrusive. "I'm Mike Thompson. I live over on Cedar Lane, just a few streets from here." I couldn't help but notice the police car. "I hope everything's okay." The woman looked at me suspiciously at first, clearly wondering who I was and why I was asking about their personal business. But when I mentioned that I lived nearby, she seemed to relax slightly. "Oh, you're from the neighborhood. I'm Margaret Peterson, and this is my husband Harold. We bought this house 3 months ago, but we're having some very unusual problems." "What kind of problems, if you don't mind me asking?" Harold stepped closer, glancing around nervously before speaking in a lowered voice. "Well, it's the strangest thing. Every night around midnight, we hear people talking in our living room. Sounds like a normal social gathering, like we have guests over for a party or something. But when you go to check, nobody there," Margaret finished. "We thought maybe it was the neighbors at first, sound carrying through the walls or something. But we've checked with everyone on the street, and the audio is definitely coming from inside our house. Have you called the police before about this?" "4 times now," Harold said, his voice carrying a note of frustration and exhaustion. "Each time they come out, walk through the entire house, don't find anything wrong, and tell us it's probably just the house settling or sound from other properties. But we know what we're hearing, and it's getting worse." "What did the officer who just left tell you?" Margaret's expression darkened. "Same thing as always. Said we were probably just hearing things, maybe needed to have our hearing checked or see a doctor about possible medication side effects. Very condescending, made us feel like we were crazy old people imagining things. But here's what really concerns us," Harold said, lowering his voice even further and looking around to make sure no one else could overhear. "Yesterday, we had those potential buyers touring the house with their real estate agent. Nice young couple in their early 30s, looking to start a family and settle down. They were in the living room examining the hardwood floors when, clear as day, we all heard voices. Multiple people having a conversation, coming from the walls themselves. What happened then? The couple left immediately," Margaret said. "Wouldn't even finish the tour, wouldn't listen to explanations. Their agent was embarrassed and upset. Kept trying to explain it away as plumbing noises or electrical issues, but they were genuinely spooked. That's when the agent called the police, thinking maybe there were squatters or intruders hiding somewhere in the house that we didn't know about. And Officer Crawford searched the entire house. Top to bottom," Harold confirmed. "Basement, attic, every closet and storage area. Used his flashlight to check places we'd never even looked. Didn't find so much as evidence that anyone else had ever been in this house. The phrase he used, 'getting worse,' sent a chill down my spine." "What do you mean when you say it's getting worse?" Margaret and Harold exchanged a meaningful look, the kind of glance that passes between married couples who have discussed something privately and reached the same disturbing conclusion. When we first moved in 3 months ago, we could barely hear them, Margaret said. Just faint murmuring, like people talking in another room with the door closed. We actually thought it was kind of comforting at first, like the house felt lived in and welcoming. But over the past few weeks, they've gotten much louder and clearer, Harold continued. Now, it's like they're sitting right there in the room with us. And there's something else that's really disturbing. What's that? They're talking about us, Margaret said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. They mention our names, discuss things we do during the day, comment on our daily routines and habits. Last night, I heard one of them say something about how I like to water my African violets every morning at 7:30, and how Harold always reads the sports section first when the newspaper arrives. They also talk about people who used to live here, Harold added. They mention Dorothy by name. That's the woman who died here before we bought the house. And they talk about someone named Frank and someone named Rose, like they're old friends catching up on news. Frank Morrison and Rose Garrett. The previous owners I had researched. The people who had died alone in houses that were later purchased by other elderly residents who also died alone. Have you ever seen anything, not just heard voices? Harold nodded slowly. Sometimes at night, when the voices are particularly active, I see shadows moving in the living room. Just out of the corner of my eye, when I look directly, there's nothing there. But the movement is definitely happening. And the temperature changes, Margaret added. The living room gets noticeably cold when the voices start. Not the whole house, just that one room. Temperature drops maybe 15 or 20 degrees, and it stays cold until the voices stop talking. There's one more thing, Harold said reluctantly. Sometimes they talk about time, about schedules, like they're waiting for something specific to happen. Last week, I heard one of them say something about almost time and not much longer now. I thanked them for talking with me and gave them my phone number, asking them to call if anything else unusual happened or if they needed someone to talk to who wouldn't dismiss their experiences as hallucinations. As I walked back to my car, I was thinking about everything they had told me. The voices were definitely getting stronger and more distinct. They were now clearly audible even to visitors who had no prior knowledge of the house's history. And they were becoming more personal, more intrusive, talking about the current residents by name and demonstrating detailed knowledge of their daily routines. Whatever was happening in these houses was evolving, becoming more powerful and more bold with each iteration. That night, I made a decision that probably saved my life, though I didn't realize it at the time. I decided to park outside 1247 Oakmont Drive and monitor the situation directly, to see if I could witness the voices that Harold and Margaret had described, and perhaps gather some evidence that might convince the authorities to take this seriously. I arrived at 11:30 p.m. and parked at the end of the street where I could observe the house, without being obvious to the residents or any neighbors who might be awake. At exactly midnight, the voices started. They were much louder than they had been 3 months earlier when the house was empty. Even from a distance of more than 100 feet, I could hear multiple conversations happening simultaneously, like a crowded room full of people all talking at once about different topics. But these weren't random conversations. As I listened more carefully, I realized they were all focused on the same subjects. Harold and Margaret Peterson. Harold worked in his garden for 3 hours this afternoon, planted tulip bulbs for spring. Margaret made her special beef stew for dinner, same recipe she's used for 40 years. They've been here 103 days now, getting very close to the right time. Won't be much longer at all. They can hear us clearly now, understand what we're saying. Soon they'll be ready to join us permanently. Just like Dorothy did. Just like Frank did. Just like Rose did. Just like all the others. The voices were talking about Harold and Margaret like they were specimens being observed, subjects in some kind of long-term experiment. And they were discussing a timeline, as if there was a specific schedule or process that needed to be completed. I grabbed my phone to call Harold and Margaret's house directly, but then stopped. What would I tell them? That I was sitting outside their house listening to invisible voices discussing their daily activities and talking about some kind of timeline. They were already scared and confused. Calling them in the middle of the night would only make things worse. Instead, I decided to approach the house and see if I could gather more specific information about what the voices were planning. As I walked closer, the conversations became clearer and more detailed. They were discussing not just Harold and Margaret, but other people in other houses, other elderly residents who were apparently part of the same pattern. The couple on Maple Street are ready, both showing signs of weakness. The woman on Oak Ridge Lane is almost there, hasn't left the house in 2 weeks. The man on Pine Valley Road stopped answering his phone yesterday. Time to start the final phase for all of them. Coordinate the timeline so they all transition together. Stronger when they join us in groups. More efficient than individual harvesting. I realized they were talking about multiple addresses. Multiple elderly residents who were all part of the same systematic process. This wasn't just about Harold and Margaret. It was about elderly people throughout the county who were being systematically isolated and prepared for something. When you've been working patrol in the same small town for 15 years, you learn to recognize patterns in ways that outsiders never could. You develop an almost supernatural sense for which calls are going to be routine traffic stops that end with handshakes and warnings, and which ones are going to haunt you for the rest of your career. You memorize the voices of frequent callers, the addresses that generate multiple complaints every month, the sounds that different types of emergencies make when they come crackling through your radio in the middle of the night, when the whole world feels dangerous and unpredictable. I'm Officer Danny Walsh, badge number 247, and I've been working the night shift for the Riverside Township Police Department since I was 22 years old. Riverside Township is one of those communities that exists in the space between suburban and rural, where most of the residents know each other by name, and the biggest crimes are usually teenagers spray painting abandoned buildings or domestic disputes that spiral out of control after too many beers and too many years of accumulated resentments. It's the kind of place where police officers are more likely to help elderly residents change flat tires than chase armed robbers through dark alleys, where most emergency calls involve medical situations or welfare checks on people who haven't been seen by their neighbors for several days. The police scanner has been my constant companion for over a decade and a half. That little black box mounted on my dashboard has carried the voices of dispatchers, fellow officers, emergency medical personnel, and sometimes terrified citizens calling for help during the worst moments of their lives. I've heard everything from routine traffic violations to fatal car accidents, from missing children who turned up safe at friends' houses to domestic violence situations that ended with someone being taken away in handcuffs or an ambulance. The scanner creates a soundtrack to police work that becomes as familiar as your own heartbeat, a constant stream of codes, call signs, and location coordinates that paint a picture of human nature in all its complexity. But there's one series of calls that still makes me reach for the volume control whenever I think I might be hearing something similar. One voice that I can still identify instantly, even though I only heard it during a handful of radio transmissions spread out over several months. One pattern of reports that taught me more about the darkness that can hide behind ordinary suburban facades than 20 years of police work had prepared me to understand. It started on a Tuesday night in October, during that quiet period between the dinner hour when families are settling in for the evening and the late-night bar crowd when things typically get more interesting for law enforcement. I was patrolling the residential neighborhoods on the west side of Riverside Township, checking on businesses that had been experiencing vandalism problems and making sure the high school parking lot wasn't being used for the kind of activities that teenagers think adults don't know about. The temperature had dropped into the 40s, and there was that crisp autumn smell in the air that always reminded me why I loved working nights in small towns. Most of the houses I passed had warm lights glowing in their windows, televisions flickering in living rooms where families were spending quiet evenings together, porch lights illuminating driveways where residents felt safe enough to leave their cars unlocked and their garage doors open. That's when dispatcher Linda Morrison's voice came through my scanner with the kind of call that always gets immediate attention from every officer within hearing distance. Unit 247, we have an anonymous tip regarding possible domestic violence in progress at 1847 Willowbrook Drive in the Meadowview subdivision. Anonymous caller reports hearing loud arguing, screaming, and what sounds like furniture being thrown or broken. Caller declined to provide contact information but stated the situation sounds serious and requested immediate police response. Domestic violence calls always generate immediate priority response in our department, partly because they can escalate from verbal arguments to life-threatening situations within minutes, and partly because we've learned from years of experience that neighbors who call about domestic disputes are usually reporting legitimate concerns about someone's safety. People generally don't call police about noise complaints unless they genuinely believe someone might be getting hurt, especially in communities like ours, where everyone knows everyone else, and calling the police on your neighbors can create long-term social complications. Unit 247, responding to 1847. Willowbrook Drive, estimated time of arrival, 4 minutes. I responded, immediately changing direction and heading toward the Meadowview subdivision. Willowbrook Drive is in one of the older residential areas of Riverside Township, mostly small single-family homes built in the 1960s and early 1970s, occupied by a mixture of elderly longtime residents who raised their families there, and young couples who are just starting out and attracted by the affordable housing prices. The houses are built close together, separated by narrow driveways and small front yards, so sound carries easily between properties. If there was a loud domestic dispute happening, multiple neighbors would probably be able to hear it, which made the anonymous tip seem credible. I pulled up in front of 1847 Willowbrook Drive and immediately began my standard assessment of the situation before making contact with the residents. The house was a modest ranch-style structure with vinyl siding and a small front porch, well maintained but showing its age. There was a blue sedan parked in the driveway, the front porch light was on, and I could see the flickering glow of a television through the living room window. Nothing about the scene suggested any kind of disturbance, violence, or emergency situation. I sat in my patrol car for about 30 seconds, listening carefully for any sounds that might indicate an ongoing domestic dispute. No shouting, no screaming, no sounds of furniture being thrown or broken. The house appeared completely peaceful and quiet. I approached the front door and knocked firmly but politely, using the kind of authoritative but non-threatening approach that usually works best for domestic violence calls where you don't know what kind of situation you might be walking into. Police Department. Someone called about a disturbance at this address. I need to speak with the residents. The door opened almost immediately, revealing a woman in her early 30s wearing casual evening clothes and holding what appeared to be a dish towel. She looked genuinely surprised and concerned to see a police officer on her doorstep, but not frightened or defensive in the way that people sometimes are when they're trying to hide evidence of domestic violence. "Officer, I'm sorry. Is there some kind of problem? Did something happen in the neighborhood?" "Ma'am, We received a report of possible domestic violence at this address. Are you okay? Is there anyone else in the house who might need assistance? Domestic violence? She looked genuinely confused and alarmed. Officer, I don't understand. I've been here all evening with my husband and our 8-year-old daughter. We've been having a very quiet night. Just finished dinner and we're watching a movie together. Is your husband available to speak with me? Of course. Please come in. I want to understand what this is about. She invited me inside, which is something that innocent people typically do when they have nothing to hide and want to cooperate with police investigations. The house was neat and comfortable, with family photos on the walls and children's artwork displayed on the refrigerator. I could see her husband sitting in the living room reading a newspaper, while their daughter worked on what appeared to be homework at the kitchen table. Everyone looked calm, relaxed, and completely normal. Sir, I'm Officer Walsh with Riverside Township Police. We received a report of possible domestic violence at this address. Has there been any kind of argument or disturbance here tonight? The husband looked up from his newspaper with the same expression of genuine confusion and concern that his wife had shown. Officer, I have no idea what you're talking about. We've had a very peaceful evening. My wife made dinner, our daughter did her homework, and we've been watching television together. I can't imagine why anyone would think there was domestic violence happening here. I conducted a standard domestic violence investigation, which includes speaking privately with each adult resident to make sure they feel safe enough to report any problems, and speaking with any children in the household to assess their well-being. Everyone in the family seemed genuinely puzzled by the report, and there were no signs of violence, distress, or fear. Have you folks been watching anything on television that might have sounded like arguing or fighting to someone outside? We were watching a nature documentary about whales, the wife said. I can't imagine how that could be mistaken for domestic violence. I checked with the neighbors on both sides of the house and across the street to see if anyone else had heard sounds of domestic violence, or could provide information about the source of the reported disturbance. Nobody else had heard any arguing, shouting, screaming, or sounds of furniture being broken. The family at 1847 Willowbrook Drive had been having exactly the kind of quiet family evening they claimed. Unit 247 to dispatch, no domestic violence situation at 1847 Willowbrook Drive. Residents are cooperative and peaceful. No signs of disturbance or violence. Family reports quiet evening at home with no arguments or conflicts. Clearing the call as unfounded. Copy, Unit 247. Return to patrol. I assumed it was just a case of mistaken address or misidentified sounds, which happens occasionally in police work. Maybe someone had heard a television program from a different house and assumed it was coming from 1847 Willowbrook Drive. Maybe there had been a legitimate domestic dispute somewhere else in the neighborhood, and the anonymous caller had given us the wrong street address. These kinds of communication errors occur several times a year in most police departments. But 5 days later, during another quiet evening shift, we received another anonymous call that made me start wondering if something more systematic might be happening. Unit 247. We have an anonymous tip regarding possible burglary in progress at 2156 Oak Ridge Circle in the Sunset Hills subdivision. Anonymous caller reports seeing someone inside the residence moving around with a flashlight, believes the homeowners are currently away on vacation and the house should be empty. Burglary in progress calls generate an immediate response from multiple units, because if there's actually a burglar inside someone's house, you want enough officers on scene to surround the property and prevent the suspect from escaping before you can make an arrest. Unit 247 responding to 2156 Oak Ridge Circle. Unit 134 also responding as backup. Unit 89 responding from the north side. Oak Ridge Circle is in one of the newer subdivisions in Riverside Township. Larger houses on bigger lots where the residents tend to be more affluent than the average for our community. The kind of neighborhood where burglars might expect to find expensive electronics, jewelry, artwork, or other valuable items worth the risk of breaking into someone's home. I arrived at 2156 Oak Ridge Circle and found a two-story colonial house with an attached two-car garage, professionally maintained landscaping, and what appeared to be two vehicles parked in the driveway. Lights were on throughout the first floor of the house, which seemed inconsistent with a burglary in progress, especially if the homeowners were supposed to be away on vacation. Officer Mike Richardson arrived as backup just as I was getting out of my patrol car to begin assessing the situation. What do you think, Danny? Looks like somebody's home to me. That's exactly what I'm thinking. Let's approach carefully just in case, but this doesn't look like a burglary scene. We walked up the front sidewalk and could hear what sounded like a television or radio playing inside the house. I knocked on the front door and identified myself as police. Police Department. We received a report of possible suspicious activity at this address. Is everyone okay in there? A man in his early 40s opened the door, wearing casual weekend clothes and holding what appeared to be a cup of coffee. He looked surprised, but not alarmed to see police officers on his front porch. Evening, officers. Is there some kind of problem? Did something happen in the neighborhood? Sir, we received a report that someone might be burglarizing this house. Are you the homeowner? Yes, this is my house. My wife and I have been here all evening watching television and reading. I can't imagine why anyone would think we were being burglarized. The caller reported seeing someone inside with a flashlight and mentioned that the homeowners were supposed to be away on vacation. Well, we're obviously not on vacation, and we've been using normal lighting all evening. No flashlights, no unusual activity. Would you like to come in and take a look around to make sure everything is secure? We accepted his invitation to conduct a quick walkthrough of the house to make sure there were no signs of forced entry or evidence that someone else had been inside. Everything was normal and secure. The homeowner's wife confirmed they had been home all evening, and there was no indication that anyone had attempted to break into the property or that any burglary had occurred. I checked with neighbors who had clear sight lines to the house to see if anyone had observed suspicious activity, flashlights, or evidence of attempted burglary. Nobody had seen anything unusual or concerning. Unit 247 to dispatch. No burglary at 2156 Oak Ridge Circle. Homeowners are present and report no suspicious activity or attempted break-in. House is secure with no signs of forced entry or disturbance. Copy, Unit 247. Clear and return to patrol. 2 anonymous calls in 5 days, both reporting serious crimes that weren't actually happening at the addresses specified. That could still be coincidence or honest mistakes, but the specificity of the reports was starting to create a pattern that bothered me. The anonymous caller in both cases had provided details that suggested some level of familiarity with the addresses and the people who lived there. In the first call, he had mentioned specific sounds, arguing, screaming, and furniture being thrown, that suggested he believed there were people inside the house and furniture that could theoretically be thrown during a domestic dispute. In the second call, he had specified someone moving around with a flashlight, and noted that the homeowners are away on vacation, which suggested he had some knowledge of the residents' normal routines and current status. 7 days later, we received a third anonymous call that made me realize we were dealing with something more serious than random false reports or innocent mistakes. Unit 247. We have an anonymous tip regarding possible child endangerment at 3789 Maple Street in the Riverside Terrace subdivision. Anonymous caller reports seeing a young child outside unattended during late evening hours. Child appears to be alone and possibly injured or distressed. Child endangerment calls get the highest priority response in our department. Every available officer heads toward the location immediately, and we typically request emergency medical backup in case a child needs immediate medical attention. Unit 247 responding to 3789 Maple Street. Unit 134 responding as backup. Unit 89 responding. Unit 156 responding. Medical Unit 23 responding for possible injured child. Within 6 minutes, we had 4 patrol cars and an ambulance converging on Maple Street, which is a quiet residential area consisting mostly of young families and professional couples. The kind of neighborhood where parents are generally very attentive to their children's safety and whereabouts, especially during evening hours when most children should be inside their homes. 3789 Maple Street was a modest 2-story house with a small front yard and children's toys visible in the driveway and on the front porch. Lights were on inside the house, and I could see what appeared to be a family dinner in progress through the kitchen window. I approached the front door, while the other officers positioned themselves around the immediate area in case we needed to search for a missing or injured child who might have wandered away from the house or been hiding somewhere nearby. Police Department. We received a report about a child who might need assistance. I need to speak with the parents or guardians. A woman in her early 30s opened the door, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel and looking concerned but not panicked. Officer, what's wrong? Is one of the neighborhood children missing or hurt? Ma'am, we received a report that there might be a young child outside this house unattended, possibly injured or in distress. Do you have children? Yes, I have 2 children, ages 6 and 9. But they've both been inside all evening. We just finished dinner, and they're getting ready for baths and bedtime routines. Would it be possible for me to speak with your children, just to make sure they're safe and accounted for? Of course, please come in. I want to understand what this is about. Both children were exactly where their mother said they would be. The 6-year-old was playing with building blocks in the living room, and the 9-year-old was clearing plates from the dinner table. Both appeared healthy, happy, and well cared for. Neither had been outside that evening, and both confirmed they had been inside the house since arriving home from school. I checked with the other officers who had conducted a thorough search of the immediate area around the house. No children found outside. No signs of anyone who appeared to be injured or in distress. No evidence that any child had been in the area unattended. We canvassed the neighbors within a 2-block radius to see if any other families were missing children or had seen a child outside unattended during the evening hours. Every family in the immediate area could account for their children, and nobody had seen any unattended child in the neighborhood. Unit 247 to dispatch. No child endangerment at 3789 Maple Street. Family's children are safe inside the house and accounted for. No missing children in the area, no evidence of child endangerment or distress. 3 anonymous calls in 12 days, all reporting serious crimes that weren't actually happening at the addresses specified. All involving different types of emergency calls, domestic violence, burglary, child endangerment, but all following the same pattern of specific details that suggested the caller had some knowledge of the addresses and the people who lived there. I started thinking about the calls more analytically, trying to identify patterns or connections that might help us understand what was happening, and whether we were dealing with a chronic false reporter, someone with mental health issues, or something more sinister. All 3 calls had come in during evening hours, between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m., during the time period when most families would be home and settled in for the night. All 3 had involved residential addresses in different neighborhoods throughout Riverside Township, suggesting the caller wasn't focused on any particular area or targeting specific residents. All three had reported crimes serious enough to generate immediate police response with multiple officers and emergency medical backup when appropriate. All three had included details that suggested the caller had been observing the addresses before making the calls, gathering information about the residents and their routines. Most importantly, all three calls had resulted in significant deployment of police resources to investigate crimes that didn't exist, leaving other areas of the township with reduced patrol coverage during the response periods. I decided to request copies of the audio recordings of all three calls to see if I could identify any characteristics that might help us track down the source of the false reports. When I listened to those recordings in the quiet of the police station during a break in my shift, several things became immediately obvious that I hadn't noticed during the initial responses. All three calls had been made by the same person. Same voice, same speech patterns, same background noise characteristics, same mannerisms in how he provided information to the dispatcher. The caller was male, probably middle-aged based on vocal characteristics, speaking calmly and clearly without any obvious signs of mental illness, substance impairment, or emotional distress that might explain false reporting behavior. Most importantly, the caller was providing information that sounded like it came from direct observation rather than guesswork or random selection of addresses. He wasn't making vague reports about suspicious activity or possible problems. He was describing specific things he claimed to be seeing or hearing in real time. But here's what really bothered me about those recordings. In each case, the details he provided were accurate for the location and the residents, even though the crimes he was reporting weren't actually happening. He correctly identified that there were people inside 1847 Willowbrook Drive, even though they weren't engaged in domestic violence. He correctly identified that the residents of 2156 Oak Ridge Circle were home, even though they weren't being burglarized. He correctly identified that there were children living at 3789 Maple Street, even though they weren't outside unattended or in danger. This wasn't random, false reporting by someone who was picking addresses out of a phone book or making up details about situations they couldn't see. Someone was conducting surveillance on these addresses, gathering accurate information about the residents and their routines, then calling in false reports about crimes that weren't actually occurring, but could plausibly be occurring based on the circumstances. The question that kept me awake during my off-duty hours was why. What was the purpose of sending police officers to investigate false crimes at addresses where the caller clearly knew no crimes were taking place? I brought my concerns to Sergeant Carol Thompson, who had been with the Riverside Township Police Department for 18 years, and had seen every type of situation that small-town police work can present. "What do you think we're dealing with here, Danny?" "I'm not sure, Sarge, but I don't think these are random false reports. It's definitely the same caller making all three reports, and the level of detail suggests he's doing serious surveillance before making each call. He knows about the residents, their routines, their family situations, their schedules. This isn't some random crank caller or someone with mental health issues. Could be someone with a grudge against specific residents trying to harass them by bringing police attention to their homes. That's possible, but the addresses are in different neighborhoods with no obvious connections between the residents. And the families all seem like normal, law-abiding people with no enemies or conflicts that would motivate this kind of harassment." "What are you thinking?" "I think he's testing us, learning about our response procedures, our investigation methods, timing how long it takes us to respond to different types of calls in different areas of the township, like reconnaissance for something bigger." Sergeant Thompson nodded thoughtfully, "Like preparation for a real crime that would require detailed knowledge of our response times and procedures." "Exactly. he might be planning something that needs to happen while our patrol units are busy responding to false emergency calls in other parts of town. We decided to implement special monitoring procedures for any future anonymous tips that seemed to fit the pattern we had identified. All officers were briefed about the false reporting situation and instructed to be extra cautious during responses in case the caller was setting up some kind of ambush or trap. We also began documenting response times and resource allocation for all emergency calls to see if we could identify any operational vulnerabilities that might be exploited by someone with criminal intentions. The fourth call came 3 weeks later, and it confirmed our worst fears about what was really happening. All units, we have an anonymous tip regarding shots fired at 4567 Pine Valley Road in the Brookfield subdivision. Anonymous caller reports hearing multiple gunshots and screaming, possible active shooter situation with multiple victims. Shots fired calls, especially those involving possible active shooters, generate the most intensive police response possible. Every available officer in the department heads toward the location at maximum speed. Neighboring departments are notified to provide mutual aid assistance, and emergency medical services are dispatched to handle potential casualties. Unit 247 responding to 4567 Pine Valley Road, ETA 3 minutes. Unit 134 responding, ETA 4 minutes. Unit 89 responding, ETA 5 minutes. Unit 156 responding, ETA 6 minutes. Sergeant Thompson responding, ETA 4 minutes. Medical units 23 and 17 responding for possible casualties. I was one of the first officers to arrive at Pine Valley Road, which is located in a newer subdivision consisting mostly of middle-class families and young professionals. 4567 Pine Valley Road was a small apartment complex with about 16 units, mostly occupied by college students and elderly residents on fixed incomes. Unit 247 on scene at 4567 Pine Valley Road. Building appears quiet from external observation. No obvious signs of ongoing disturbance, no sounds of gunfire or screaming. Unit 134 on scene. Unit 89 on scene, Unit 156 on scene. Sergeant Thompson on scene. Within 7 minutes, we had 5 officers surrounding the apartment complex and establishing a security perimeter in case we were dealing with an active shooter or armed suspects who might try to escape after committing violence. All units were going to conduct a systematic search for possible shooting victims or armed suspects. Standard active shooter protocols. Clear each unit methodically, maintain communication, assume suspects may still be present until we confirm otherwise. We began going door to door, identifying ourselves as police, and asking residents if they had heard gunshots, screaming, or seen any signs of violence or disturbance. Every person we spoke with was cooperative and concerned about the reports, but nobody had heard gunshots or anything that sounded like an active shooter situation. The apartment complex manager met us in the lobby with master keys to vacant units, and we systematically searched every apartment in the building. No shooting victims, no evidence of gunfire, no signs of violence, disturbance, or criminal activity. All units, Pine Valley Road apartment complex is clear. No shooting victims, no evidence of gunfire, no signs of active shooter activity or violence. But while we were conducting our intensive search for a non-existent active shooter, something else was happening on the other side of Riverside Township that we didn't discover until several hours later. Mr. Robert Henderson, a 79-year-old retired businessman who lived alone in a large house on the wealthy side of town, was robbed during the exact time period when every police officer in Riverside Township was searching for shooting victims who didn't exist. The robbery wasn't discovered until the next morning, when Mr. Henderson's housekeeper arrived for her weekly cleaning and found him tied up in his study. He had been bound and gagged, but was physically unharmed except for some bruising on his wrists from the restraints. The robbers had taken approximately $8,000 in cash that he kept in a home safe, along with several pieces of expensive jewelry and a collection of rare coins that had been in his family for generations. Mr. Henderson told us that 3 men had broken into his house through a basement window around 11:45 p.m., just 20 minutes after we had responded to the false shots fired call. They had seemed to know exactly where he kept his valuables and had moved through his house with confidence and efficiency, suggesting they had been watching his property and learning his routines for some extended period of time. Most disturbing of all, he said the men had seemed unusually relaxed and unhurried during the robbery, like they knew they had plenty of time to search the house thoroughly without worrying about police interruption. They kept checking their watches and talking about having at least 30 more minutes before they needed to leave, he told us during his statement, like they were following some kind of predetermined schedule. 30 minutes was approximately how long it had taken us to complete our systematic search of the Pine Valley Road apartment complex and determine that the shots fired call was a false report. Our anonymous caller had been studying our response procedures not so he could commit random pranks or harassment, but so he could time serious crimes to occur while all available police officers were distracted by false emergency calls in other parts of the township. But this was just the beginning of what turned out to be a sophisticated criminal operation that used false police reports as a way to manipulate law enforcement response and create opportunities for major crimes. The 5th call came 4 weeks later, and it demonstrated an escalation in both the sophistication of the false reports and the seriousness of the crimes that occurred while we were responding to them. All units, we have an anonymous tip regarding a possible kidnapping at 2847 Willowbrook Circle in the Meadowview subdivision. Anonymous caller reports seeing a woman being forced into a vehicle against her will by 2 unknown males, possible abduction in progress. Kidnapping calls generate an even more intensive response than active shooter situations because the victim might be taken out of our jurisdiction within minutes, making rescue much more difficult and dangerous. Unit 247 responding to 2847 Willowbrook Circle. Unit 134 responding. Unit 89 responding. Unit 156 responding. Sergeant Thompson responding. Every officer in our department responded to the kidnapping call, along with units from 2 neighboring departments and state police. We established roadblocks on all major routes out of Riverside Township and began an extensive search for the reported victim and her abductors. After 4 hours of intensive searching involving dozens of officers and multiple agencies, we determined that no kidnapping had occurred. Every resident of Willowbrook Circle was accounted for and safe. No one had seen any suspicious vehicles or evidence of an abduction attempt. But while we were searching for a kidnapping victim who didn't exist, 3 more serious crimes were committed in areas of the township that had no police coverage because every available officer was involved in the kidnapping response. An elderly couple, Harold and Margaret Foster, were robbed in their home on the east side of town. The robbers had disabled their home security system and taken over $15,000 in cash and jewelry. The Riverside Township Community Bank was burglarized through a sophisticated entry that bypassed multiple security systems. The burglars had accessed the main vault and stolen an undetermined amount of cash. A local jewelry store was broken into and robbed of over $50,000 worth of merchandise. All 3 crimes occurred during the exact time window when every police officer in the township was involved in searching for a kidnapping that never happened. The coordination required to execute 3 simultaneous major crimes, while law enforcement was distracted by a false emergency call suggested we were dealing with a well-organized criminal enterprise, rather than individual opportunists who happened to notice that police were busy elsewhere. the pattern was becoming clear and terrifying. Our anonymous caller was using increasingly serious false emergency calls to draw all available police officers away from patrol, creating opportunities for accomplices to commit major crimes in areas with no police coverage. But the most disturbing realization came when we analyzed the timing and logistics of the crimes that occurred during our responses to false calls. The robberies were too well coordinated and executed to be the work of random criminals who simply noticed that police were distracted. The perpetrators knew exactly when to strike, exactly how long they had before police could respond to their actual crimes, and exactly which targets would provide maximum profit with minimum risk. Someone was providing the criminal teams with detailed intelligence about police operations, response times, deployment patterns, and the locations of vulnerable, high-value targets. Our anonymous caller wasn't just creating diversions to facilitate other crimes. He was coordinating a sophisticated criminal network that used false police reports as a central strategy for controlling the law enforcement response and creating windows of opportunity for major theft operations. The sixth call came 5 weeks later, and it nearly resulted in a complete breakdown of our ability to respond to genuine emergencies throughout Riverside Township. All units, we have a report of an officer down at the intersection of Main Street and Oak Avenue. Officer requesting immediate backup and emergency medical assistance for life-threatening injuries. Officer down calls trigger the most intensive emergency response possible in law enforcement. Every available officer, paramedic, emergency medical technician, and emergency vehicle in the area heads toward the location at maximum speed, regardless of traffic laws or personal safety considerations. Nothing else matters when one of your own colleagues needs help. I was patrolling the residential area on the south side of town when the call came through my scanner, and I drove faster and more recklessly than I had ever driven in 15 years as a police officer. When a fellow officer is in trouble, you don't worry about speed limits, traffic signals, or personal safety. You get there as fast as humanly possible and deal with whatever you find when you arrive. Unit 247 responding to Main and Oak, ETA 90 seconds. Unit 134 responding, ETA 2 minutes. Unit 89 responding, ETA 3 minutes. Unit 156 responding, ETA 3 minutes. Sergeant Thompson responding, ETA 2 minutes. Medical units 23, 17, and 31 responding for officer down, ETA 3 minutes. State police units responding for officer assistance. When I arrived at the intersection of Main Street and Oak Avenue with my heart pounding and adrenaline surging through my system, I found nothing. No injured officer, no patrol car, no signs of any kind of emergency, disturbance, or criminal activity. Unit 247 on scene at Main and Oak. No officer down, no patrol vehicle visible, no signs of emergency or disturbance. Unit 134 on scene. Confirming no officer down, no emergency situation apparent. Sergeant Thompson on scene. All units conduct immediate radio check to confirm all officers are accounted for and safe. We conducted an emergency radio check of every officer in the Riverside Township Police Department. Everyone was accounted for, safe, and had not called for backup or medical assistance. But the call reporting an officer down had sounded exactly like one of our own officers requesting help. Same radio protocol, same terminology, same vocal characteristics, same sense of urgency and desperation that comes when an officer is genuinely in life-threatening trouble. That's when we realized our anonymous caller had developed the ability to mimic police radio transmissions with enough accuracy to fool even experienced officers who work with the same voices every day. And while every officer in our department, along with units from neighboring departments and state police, was rushing to help a colleague who didn't need help, The most audacious crime yet was being committed on the other side of Riverside Township. The Riverside Township Savings and Loan, the largest financial institution in our community, was robbed by a team of at least 5 armed men who seemed to know every detail of the bank's security procedures, employee schedules, and physical layout. They had entered the building during the brief period between the end of normal business hours and the activation of the overnight security system. They had disabled all electronic security measures, forced the bank manager to open both the main vault and the safe deposit box area, and escaped with over $300,000 in cash plus an unknown amount of valuables from safe deposit boxes. The robbery had been planned and executed with military precision, occurring during the exact time window when every law enforcement officer in the region was responding to a false report of an officer in distress. Security camera footage showed that the robbers had moved through the bank like they owned it, accessing restricted areas and demonstrating knowledge of procedures that only bank employees should have possessed. But the most chilling moment captured on the security cameras was when one of the robbers looked directly into the lens and said, "Thanks for keeping the boys in blue busy for us." Our anonymous caller and his criminal organization had been planning this bank robbery for months, using all his previous false emergency calls to study our response procedures, test our reaction times, and perfect his ability to draw every police officer away from patrol at exactly the right moment. But there was something even more disturbing that we discovered during the investigation of the savings and loan robbery. During the weeks leading up to the bank robbery, someone had been conducting extensive surveillance, not just on potential crime targets, but on our police station itself. We found evidence that someone had been watching our building for extended periods, learning our shift schedules, monitoring when officers arrived and departed, documenting our patrol patterns and response procedures, footprints in the landscaping around our police station, cigarette butts near the employee parking area, tire tracks in a vacant lot across the street that provided a clear view of our building, all indicating that someone had been studying us as thoroughly as we typically study crime scenes. Our anonymous caller hadn't just been learning how to manipulate our response to emergency calls. He had been conducting comprehensive intelligence gathering on our department's personnel, procedures, and operational patterns. He knew us better than we knew ourselves. The investigation that followed the bank robbery involved federal agencies, state police, and multiple county sheriff's departments. Despite analyzing all the evidence from every crime scene, despite following up on hundreds of tips and leads from concerned citizens, despite offering substantial rewards for information leading to arrests, despite conducting extensive forensic analysis of physical evidence and digital communications, the criminal organization was never identified, located, or apprehended. But that wasn't the end of our nightmare. 8 months later, I started hearing reports from other police departments in neighboring counties about similar patterns of anonymous calls and coordinated crimes. The methodology was always the same. Months of false reports about domestic violence, burglary, and child endangerment designed to study police response procedures and timing. Anonymous calls that provided accurate details about addresses and residents, but reported crimes that weren't actually happening. Systematic testing of law enforcement capabilities and reaction times, then escalating false emergencies, shots, fired calls, kidnapping reports, officer down situations, each one more serious and more convincing than the last, each one designed to draw maximum police response away from other areas. And finally, major crimes, bank robberies, jewelry store heists, armored car robberies that occurred during the exact time windows when all available law enforcement was responding to false emergency calls. According to a federal task force that was eventually established to track these cases, the pattern has been repeated in at least 23 different jurisdictions across 7 states over the past 3 years. The criminal organization has stolen over $25 million using this methodology, and they have never been caught, identified, or even seriously threatened by law enforcement efforts. But what bothers me most about this case isn't the sophistication of their methods, the amount of money they've stolen, or even the fact that they've never been apprehended. What bothers me is the gradual realization that they're probably operating in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously, conducting reconnaissance and preparation for future crimes, while we're still trying to understand what happened in the crimes they've already committed. How many anonymous tips are law enforcement agencies responding to right now that are actually reconnaissance missions for future criminal operations? How many false emergency calls are being used to test police response procedures at this very moment? How many departments are unknowingly providing intelligence about their capabilities and vulnerabilities to criminals who are planning to exploit that information? The anonymous caller and his organization discovered something that should terrify every police officer in America. They found a way to turn our own dedication to public safety against us. They used our commitment to investigating every tip, responding quickly to every emergency, and helping every person who calls for assistance as weapons in their criminal enterprise. They understood that we would always respond to reports of domestic violence because we've seen what happens when those calls are ignored. They knew we would always investigate possible child endangerment because the cost of failing to protect a child is unacceptable. They counted on our willingness to risk our lives for fellow officers because that's what the badge means. And they were right. We couldn't ignore those calls, even when we suspected they might be false. We couldn't take the chance that a real emergency was happening while we dismissed it as another fake report. That's what makes them so dangerous. And that's why I still hear that anonymous voice in my nightmares, even though it's been over 2 years since the last call came through my scanner. Because somewhere out there right now, that voice is probably talking to a dispatcher in another town, reporting another false emergency, testing another police department's response procedures, gathering intelligence for another major crime. The voice is still anonymous. The caller is still unidentified. The criminal organization is still active. And there's nothing we can do to stop them except hope that someday, somewhere, they'll make a mistake that allows law enforcement to identify and arrest them before they manipulate another police department into providing cover for their crimes. But so far, they haven't made any mistakes that we've been able to detect or exploit, and I'm afraid they never will. Every time my scanner crackles with a new anonymous tip, every time I hear about shots fired or officer down calls in other jurisdictions, every time another bank gets robbed while police are responding to false emergencies, I wonder if I'm hearing the voice again. The voice that taught me more about the vulnerability of law enforcement than 15 years of police training had prepared me to understand. The voice that proved our own integrity and dedication could be used against us by people who understand human nature better than we understand criminal behavior. The voice that's still out there, still anonymous, still calling in false reports and coordinating real crimes while police officers chase ghosts and respond to emergencies that don't exist. The worst part is that we learned nothing from the experience that would help us prevent it from happening again. We can't stop responding to anonymous tips because too many of them are legitimate. We can't ignore emergency calls because the cost of missing a real emergency is too high. We can't change our fundamental commitment to protecting and serving the public because that's what defines us as police officers. All we can do is hope that other departments will learn from our experience and be better prepared to recognize the signs of systematic false reporting before they become victims of the same kind of manipulation. But I don't think they will be better prepared. I think every police department believes it could never happen to them, just like we believed it could never happen to us, until it did. The anonymous caller understood something about police work that most criminals never figure out. Our greatest strength is also our greatest weakness. Our willingness to help people, to respond to every call, to risk our lives for strangers and colleagues. Those are the qualities that make us effective police officers. But they're also the qualities that made us vulnerable to manipulation by someone who studied our procedures and used our own dedication against us. That voice is still out there somewhere, probably listening to police scanner traffic in another town, taking notes about response times and procedures, planning the next phase of whatever criminal operation he's coordinating. And every police officer who hears an anonymous tip should remember that sometimes the person calling for help isn't the victim. Sometimes the person calling for help is the criminal. And sometimes the help they're asking for is actually assistance in committing crimes that we would never knowingly facilitate. The scanner continues to crackle with voices every night. Dispatchers, officers, emergency personnel, citizens calling for help during the worst moments of their lives. Most of those voices are legitimate, honest, and desperately needed. But somewhere in that mix of legitimate emergency calls and genuine requests for assistance, there might be another anonymous caller testing response procedures, gathering intelligence, and planning crimes that will occur while we're busy responding to emergencies that don't exist. The voice that made me realize that sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones who sound the most helpful. The voice that taught me to be suspicious of people who call for help but don't want to be identified. The voice that's still out there, still anonymous, still planning the next operation. Some police calls stick with you because of what you find when you arrive on scene. Others haunt you because of what you don't find, what doesn't make sense, what leaves you with more questions than answers, and the unsettling feeling that you've stumbled into something that exists just beyond the edge of normal human experience. After 17 years working patrol in Millfield Township, I thought I'd seen every type of call our small community could generate, but there's one series of incidents that still makes me question my own memory, my own sanity, and my understanding of how time itself is supposed to work. I'm Officer Steve Patterson, Badge 89, and I've been working the evening shift for Millfield Township Police Department since I was 25 years old. Millfield Township is one of those places that exists in the comfortable space between small town and suburb, where most residents have lived their entire lives and everybody knows their neighbors by name. It's the kind of community where the biggest problems are usually noise complaints about teenage parties or domestic disputes that get resolved with conversations rather than arrests, where most emergency calls involve medical situations or minor traffic accidents that happen when people are driving too fast on rural roads they've traveled 1,000 times before. The police scanner has been my constant companion for nearly 2 decades. That familiar black box mounted on my dashboard that carries the voices of dispatchers, fellow officers, emergency medical personnel, and citizens calling for help during various crises both large and small. The scanner creates a soundtrack to police work that becomes as familiar as your own breathing. A constant stream of call signs, location coordinates, and status updates that paint an audio picture of human nature in all its complexity and unpredictability. But there's one pattern of calls that defied everything I thought I understood about police work, about time, about memory, and about the fundamental nature of reality itself. Calls that seemed normal when they came through the scanner, but became increasingly strange and disturbing when you tried to piece together what had actually happened afterward. Calls that left me with gaps in my own memory and the terrifying suspicion that sometimes, when you respond to certain types of emergencies, you don't come back exactly the same person who left. It started on a Wednesday evening in September, during that comfortable time just after dinner when most families are settling in for the night and criminal activity is typically at its lowest point of the day. I was patrolling the residential neighborhoods on the north side of Millfield Township, making my standard rounds through areas that had been experiencing some minor vandalism problems, when dispatcher Jennifer Mills' voice came through my scanner with what seemed like a routine traffic stop assistance request. Unit 89, we have a motorist assistance call at the intersection of Elm Street and County Road 15. Caller reports a vehicle stopped in the roadway with hazard lights on. Driver appears to need help. Motorist assistance calls are among the most common requests we handle during evening shifts. People run out of gas, have flat tires, experience mechanical problems, or simply get lost and need directions. Most of these situations are resolved within 15 or 20 minutes with either roadside assistance or a quick phone call to family members. Unit 89 responding to motorist assistance at Elm and County Road 15, ETA 4 minutes. The intersection of Elm Street and County Road 15 is in a quiet residential area where the houses are spread out on larger lots and the roads are narrow and winding. It's the kind of location where a disabled vehicle could create a traffic hazard, especially during evening hours when visibility is reduced and drivers might not see a stopped car until they're very close to it. I arrived at the intersection exactly 4 minutes later and found a blue sedan parked at an angle in the roadway with its hazard lights flashing. The vehicle appeared to be a recent model car in good condition, not the type of older vehicle that typically experiences mechanical breakdowns. I parked my patrol car behind the sedan with my emergency lights activated to warn approaching traffic, and approached the driver's side of the vehicle. The driver was a woman, probably in her early 40s, sitting behind the wheel and staring straight ahead through the windshield. She didn't acknowledge my approach or respond when I tapped gently on her window. "Ma'am?" "Police officer. I understand you called for assistance?" She turned toward me very slowly, and I could see that her eyes looked unfocused and confused, like someone who had just woken up from a deep sleep or was disoriented by medication or illness. "Officer, where am I?" "You're at the intersection of Elm Street and County Road 15 in Millfield Township. Someone called to report that you needed assistance. Are you feeling all right?" "I don't remember calling anyone. I don't remember stopping here. I was driving home from work. And then, I don't know what happened." I asked her to step out of the vehicle so I could assess whether she might be experiencing a medical emergency or was impaired by alcohol or drugs. She seemed physically steady but mentally confused, like someone suffering from a concussion or memory loss. "Ma'am, what's the last thing you remember clearly?" "I was leaving the office building where I work. I got in my car and started driving home just like I do every day, but I don't remember anything after that until you knocked on my window." "What time did you leave work?" "Around 5:30, like always." I checked my watch. It was 7:45 p.m. She'd been driving for over 2 hours, but the distance from the main office buildings in Millfield Township to this intersection was only about 15 minutes under normal traffic conditions. "Ma'am, it's almost 8 p.m. now. If you left work at 5:30, that's more than 2 hours ago. Do you have any idea where you've been or what you've been doing during that time?" She looked genuinely shocked and frightened. "That's impossible. I just left work a few minutes ago. How could it be 8 o'clock? I conducted standard field sobriety tests, but she showed no signs of alcohol or drug impairment. Her speech was clear, her coordination was normal, and she could answer basic questions about her identity and personal information. But she had absolutely no memory of the past 2 hours. "Ma'am, I think you should see a doctor. Memory loss like this could indicate a medical problem that needs immediate attention." "I feel fine, physically. I just don't understand how I lost 2 hours of my life." I followed her to the nearest hospital emergency room to make sure she received medical evaluation for her memory loss. The emergency room physician conducted a thorough examination, including blood tests for drugs and alcohol, neurological tests for signs of stroke or brain injury, and cognitive assessments for mental status. Everything came back normal. No signs of medical problems, no evidence of substance use, no neurological deficits that would explain her memory loss. "Officer Patterson, this is very unusual," the doctor told me privately. "Mrs. Harrison appears to be in perfect health, but she has a complete gap in her memory covering approximately 2.5 hours. I've never seen anything like this in someone who shows no other symptoms of illness or injury." Mrs. Harrison was released from the hospital with instructions to follow up with her personal physician, but no explanation for her missing hours or memory loss. I filed a standard report about the motorist assistance call and the medical evaluation, but something about the entire incident bothered me in ways I couldn't articulate. There was no crime, no accident, no evidence of any problem other than a woman who had somehow lost 2 hours of her life while driving a familiar route home from work. 3 weeks later, during another routine evening shift, I received a call that followed almost exactly the same pattern. "Unit 89. We have a motorist assistance call at the intersection of Oak Avenue and Hillside Drive. Caller reports a vehicle stopped in the roadway. Driver appears confused and disoriented." Unit 89, responding to motorist assistance at Oak and Hillside. ETA 6 minutes. I arrived at the intersection and found a red pickup truck parked at an angle in the roadway with its hazard lights flashing. The driver was a man in his 30s, sitting behind the wheel and staring straight ahead with the same unfocused, confused expression I had seen on Mrs. Harrison's face. "Sir?" "Police officer. Someone called to report that you needed assistance." He turned toward me slowly, blinking like someone trying to wake up from a deep sleep. "Officer? How did I get here?" "I was driving home from the hardware store and then... I don't remember anything." "Sir, what time did you leave the hardware store?" "About 4 o'clock, maybe 4:15. I checked my watch. It was 7:30 p.m. Another case of missing hours with no explanation. The man, David Collins, had no memory of the past 3 hours. He remembered leaving Millfield Hardware with supplies for a home repair project, getting in his truck, and starting to drive home. But he had no recollection of anything that happened between leaving the hardware store and me knocking on his window." Like Mrs. Harrison, David Collins showed no signs of medical problems, substance impairment, or neurological deficits. Emergency room evaluation found him to be in perfect health with no explanation for his memory loss. 2 cases in 3 weeks, both involving healthy adults who had lost several hours of their lives while driving familiar routes in Millfield Township. Both cases involved people who were found stopped in roadways with no memory of how they got there or what had happened during their missing hours. I started paying closer attention to unusual calls and incidents that might be related to the memory loss cases, looking for patterns or connections that might help explain what was happening. 4 weeks later, I received a third call that confirmed we were dealing with something systematic and deeply disturbing. Unit 89. We have a welfare check request at 2156 Pine Street. Neighbor reports that homeowner was supposed to attend a family dinner 3 hours ago but never arrived. Family is concerned because this is very unusual behavior. Welfare checks for adults who fail to arrive at expected destinations are common in police work, especially in communities where people maintain close family relationships and notice when someone doesn't show up as planned. Unit 89, responding to welfare check at 2156 Pine Street. Pine Street is in an older residential neighborhood where most of the houses were built in the 1960s and are occupied by longtime residents who have raised their families there. 2156 Pine Street was a modest ranch-style house with a well-maintained yard and 2 vehicles parked in the driveway. I knocked on the front door and was greeted by a woman in her 50s who looked confused and slightly embarrassed. "Officer, I'm sorry someone called you. I'm not sure why my family was worried." "Ma'am, your family reported that you were supposed to attend a dinner 3 hours ago but never arrived. They were concerned because they said this was very unusual for you." 3 hours ago? That's impossible. I just got home from running errands a few minutes ago." I checked my watch. It was 8:15 p.m. "Ma'am, what time did you leave home to run errands?" "Around 4:30. I had to go to the bank and the grocery store. Then I was going to drive directly to my daughter's house for dinner at 5:30. Banking and grocery errands that should have taken less than an hour, followed by a dinner appointment that was nearly 3 hours overdue. Another case of missing time with no explanation. Do you remember completing your errands at the bank and grocery store?" I think so. I remember driving to the bank, but after that everything is kind of fuzzy. The next thing I clearly remember is pulling into my driveway just before you arrived." Margaret Foster had lost approximately 3.5 hours while running routine errands in a town where she had lived for over 30 years. Like the previous cases, medical evaluation found no evidence of health problems that would explain her memory loss. 3 cases in 7 weeks, all involving healthy adults who had lost hours of their lives while driving familiar routes or completing routine activities in Millfield Township. All 3 people were found in vehicles with no memory of extended periods of time. All showed no signs of medical or substance-related problems, and all had gaps in their memory that medical professionals couldn't explain. I started documenting every unusual call or incident that might be related to the memory loss cases, looking for connections or patterns that could help us understand what was happening in our community. But the 4th case made me realize that the memory loss wasn't limited to citizens. It was affecting police officers as well. It happened during a routine patrol shift in October, when I was conducting my standard evening rounds through the residential areas on the west side of Millfield Township. I was driving my normal patrol route, checking on businesses and neighborhoods that had experienced some minor vandalism problems, when something very strange occurred. I was monitoring radio traffic and listening to routine communications between dispatch and other patrol units when I heard my own voice come through the scanner. "Unit 89 to dispatch. I'm responding to a domestic disturbance call at 3478 Maple Avenue." But I hadn't made that radio transmission. I was driving on Oak Street, nowhere near Maple Avenue, and I hadn't received any assignment to respond to a domestic disturbance call. "Unit 89, copy your response to domestic disturbance at 3478 Maple Avenue, ETA. Unit 89, ETA approximately 5 minutes. I heard my own voice giving an estimated time of arrival for a call I hadn't received and a location I wasn't driving toward. But I was definitely hearing my own voice, my own speech patterns, my own manner of communicating with dispatch. I immediately radioed dispatch to clarify the situation. "Dispatch, this is Unit 89. I did not receive an assignment for domestic disturbance at 3478 Maple Avenue, and I am not responding to that location." "Unit 89, you just advised that you were responding to domestic disturbance at 3478 Maple Avenue with ETA 5 minutes. "Negative, dispatch. I am currently on Oak Street conducting routine patrol. I have not received any assignment for domestic disturbance." There was a pause that lasted longer than normal dispatch response times. "Unit 89, please confirm your current location." Unit 89 is on Oak Street between 4th and 5th Avenue, conducting routine patrol. "Copy, Unit 89. Stand by for status check." Another pause, Then dispatcher Jennifer Mills came back on the radio with something I had never heard in 17 years of police work. Unit 89, we show you responding to domestic disturbance at 3478 Maple Avenue. Our computer system indicates you acknowledged the call and provided ETA. Can you explain the discrepancy? I couldn't explain the discrepancy because I had no memory of receiving or acknowledging any domestic disturbance call. According to dispatch records, I had been assigned to respond to 3478 Maple Avenue, had acknowledged the assignment, and had provided an estimated time of arrival. But I had no recollection of any of those communications. Dispatch, I need to return to the station to review my activity log and discuss this situation with the supervisor. Copy, Unit 89. Sergeant Williams is available to meet with you. I drove back to the police station with a growing sense of unease about what was happening to my own memory and perception of reality. If I was having conversations with dispatch that I couldn't remember, if I was accepting assignments and making commitments that I had no recollection of, then the memory loss phenomenon affecting Millfield Township residents was also affecting me. Sergeant Williams reviewed the dispatch logs and computer records, which clearly showed that I had been assigned to respond to a domestic disturbance call at 3478 Maple Avenue, had acknowledged the assignment over the radio, and had provided an estimated time of arrival. But I had no memory of any of those interactions. Steve, this is very concerning. If you're having memory issues while on duty, we need to have you evaluated by a medical professional immediately. Sarge, I feel completely normal. I remember everything else about my shift clearly. It's just that one radio conversation that I can't recall. We reviewed the audio recordings of my radio transmissions. There was definitely my voice acknowledging the domestic disturbance call and providing an ETA. But listening to the recording was like hearing someone else speaking with my voice, saying things I had never said, and making commitments I didn't remember making. Steve, I want you to take the rest of the night off and see a doctor tomorrow. Until we understand what's causing these memory issues, I can't have you on patrol. I went home that night deeply disturbed by the realization that I was experiencing the same type of memory loss that had been affecting other Millfield Township residents. But unlike the citizens who had lost hours of their lives, I had lost only a few minutes, just long enough for a brief radio conversation that I couldn't remember having. The medical evaluation found nothing wrong with me. Blood tests, neurological examination, cognitive assessment, everything came back normal. Like the other memory loss cases, there was no medical explanation for my missing memories. But the pattern was becoming clear and terrifying. Something in Millfield Township was causing people to lose periods of time from their lives, creating gaps in memory that couldn't be explained by medical science or psychological evaluation. The fifth case occurred 3 days after my own memory loss incident, and it involved someone who had experienced multiple episodes of missing time over several weeks. Unit 67. We have a welfare check request at 4523 Elm Street. Caller reports that neighbor has been acting strangely for several weeks, often appears confused and disoriented. Officer Mike Rodriguez responded to the welfare check and found a situation that was both familiar and deeply disturbing. The neighbor, Robert Martinez, was a retired teacher who had lived in Millfield Township for over 40 years. According to his next-door neighbor, Robert had been experiencing episodes of confusion and disorientation for the past month, often appearing to lose track of time and forgetting conversations or activities that had occurred earlier the same day. He'll be working in his garden in the morning, and by afternoon he has no memory of having been outside, the neighbor explained. Last week I saw him mowing his lawn at 2 p.m., but when I asked him about it later that same day, he insisted he hadn't mowed the lawn in weeks. When Officer Rodriguez interviewed Robert Martinez, he discovered a pattern of memory loss that was far more extensive than the previous cases. Robert reported experiencing multiple episodes per week where he would lose several hours of time. He would start an activity, reading a book, watching television, working on a hobby project, and suddenly find himself in a different location with no memory of how he got there or what he had been doing. Sometimes I'll be reading in my living room chair, and the next thing I know, I'm standing in my backyard with no idea how I got there or how much time has passed, Robert told Officer Rodriguez. Other times I'll start preparing dinner and then find myself sitting at the kitchen table with a plate of food I don't remember cooking. Robert's memory loss episodes were happening multiple times per week and had been occurring for over a month. Unlike the previous cases, his missing time periods ranged from 30 minutes to several hours, and he often found himself in different locations within his own home, with no recollection of moving from one place to another. Medical evaluation found Robert to be in excellent health for his age, with no signs of dementia, stroke, or other neurological conditions that would explain his memory loss. 5 cases in 2 months, all involving healthy adults who were experiencing unexplained memory loss ranging from minutes to hours. All medical evaluations found no underlying health problems that would cause such symptoms. All cases occurred in Millfield Township within a relatively small geographic area. Something was systematically affecting the memory and perception of time for people living in our community, and medical science couldn't explain what was causing it or how to prevent it. But the 6th case made me realize that the memory loss was just the beginning of something much more disturbing and dangerous. It happened during a routine evening patrol in November, when I was driving through the residential neighborhoods on the south side of Millfield Township. I was monitoring routine radio traffic when I heard a transmission that made my blood run cold. Unit 89 to dispatch. I have a deceased person at 1847 Willow Drive, requesting coroner and detective units. But I was driving on Pine Street, nowhere near Willow Drive, and I definitely hadn't discovered any deceased person. Yet, I was hearing my own voice reporting a death investigation over the police radio. Unit 89, copy report of deceased person at 1847 Willow Drive. What are the circumstances? Unit 89, elderly male, appears to be natural causes, but the scene has some unusual characteristics that require investigation. I immediately radio dispatch to clarify the situation. Dispatch, this is Unit 89. I did not report a deceased person at any location. I am currently on Pine Street conducting routine patrol. Unit 89, you just reported a deceased person at 1847 Willow Drive and requested coroner and detective response. Negative. Dispatch. I have not discovered any deceased person and I am not at 1847 Willow Drive. Unit 89, please confirm your current location immediately. Unit 89 is on Pine Street between Oak and Elm Avenue. There was a long pause before dispatch responded. Unit 89, we need you to respond to 1847 Willow Drive immediately to clarify the situation. I drove to 1847 Willow Drive with a growing sense of dread about what I might find there. If my voice had reported a deceased person, if dispatch had recordings of me requesting coroner and detective units, then something had happened at that address, even though I had no memory of being there. 1847 Willow Drive was a small ranch-style house in an older neighborhood. When I arrived, I found the front door standing open and signs of disturbance inside the house. An elderly man was lying on the living room floor, clearly deceased. Based on the condition of the body, he had been dead for several hours. But here's what made the situation truly terrifying. I had no memory of ever being inside that house before, no recollection of discovering the body, and no explanation for how I could have made radio transmissions about a death investigation that I couldn't remember conducting. According to dispatch records, I had been at 1847 Willow Drive for over an hour, conducting a preliminary death investigation and coordinating with coroner and detective units. But I had no memory of any of those activities. The coroner and detective units arrived to find me standing outside the house, completely confused about how I had come to be there and what I was supposed to have discovered inside. "Steve, you called us out here for a death investigation," Detective Sarah Collins said. "What can you tell us about the circumstances?" "Sarah, I have no memory of being inside that house or discovering the body. I don't remember making any radio transmissions about a deceased person. But we have recordings of your voice reporting the death and requesting our response. You provided details about the scene and the condition of the body." Detective Collins reviewed the audio recordings of my radio transmissions. There was definitely my voice providing detailed information about the deceased person, the condition of the body, and the circumstances of the discovery. But listening to those recordings was like hearing someone else speak with my voice, reporting things I had never seen, and describing a crime scene I had never entered. The investigation of the death revealed that the elderly man, Walter Thompson, had died of natural causes approximately 6 to 8 hours before his body was discovered. But there was no explanation for how I could have reported finding his body and provided detailed information about the scene when I had no memory of ever being inside his house. This was far more serious than simple memory loss. This was a complete disconnection between my actions and my consciousness, between what I was apparently doing and what I could remember doing. Sergeant Williams placed me on administrative leave pending a comprehensive medical and psychological evaluation. "Steve, if you're conducting investigations and making radio transmissions that you can't remember, we have a serious problem. I can't have an officer on the street who doesn't know what he's been doing or where he's been." The medical evaluation was more extensive than the previous tests, including brain imaging, sleep studies, and psychological assessments. But like all the other memory loss cases, the results showed nothing abnormal. "Officer Patterson, you appear to be in excellent physical and mental health," the doctor told me. "But you're experiencing episodes of what we call dissociative amnesia, periods where you're apparently functioning normally, but have no conscious memory of your actions. This is extremely unusual in someone with no history of trauma or psychological disorders. But I wasn't the only police officer experiencing these problems. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 other officers in our department reported similar episodes of memory loss and missing time. Officer Rodriguez discovered that he had apparently conducted a traffic stop and issued a citation that he couldn't remember writing. Officer Jackson found himself at the scene of a burglary investigation with no recollection of how he had gotten there or what he was supposed to be investigating. Officer Taylor realized she had been having radio conversations with dispatch about calls she couldn't remember receiving. 4 police officers, all experiencing episodes where they appeared to be conducting normal police duties but had no conscious memory of their actions. All medical evaluations found nothing wrong. All cases occurred within a few weeks of each other in Millfield Township. Something was affecting not just the citizens of our community, but the law enforcement officers who were supposed to protect them. Something was creating gaps in memory and consciousness that medical science couldn't explain or treat. But the most disturbing realization came when we started comparing the timing of our memory loss episodes with the locations where they occurred. All of the memory loss incidents, both citizens and police officer, had occurred within a specific geographic area of Millfield Township. The affected area was roughly circular, approximately 3 miles in diameter, centered around the intersection of Main Street and County Road 7. Within that area, people were losing hours or even days of their lives. Outside that area, no memory loss incidents had been reported. Something in that specific location was affecting human memory and consciousness in ways that defied medical understanding. We contacted state and federal authorities about the pattern of memory loss incidents, but they had no explanation for what could cause such symptoms in a specific geographic area. Environmental testing found no unusual chemicals, radiation, or other hazards that might affect brain function. Geological surveys found no unusual mineral deposits or electromagnetic anomalies. Meteorological data showed no unusual weather patterns or atmospheric conditions. There was no scientific explanation for why people were losing their memories in that specific area of Millfield Township. But the memory loss episodes continued, affecting more people each week. Mrs. Harrison, the first person I had encountered with memory loss, started experiencing multiple episodes per week. She would leave her house to run errands and find herself parked in unfamiliar locations with no memory of how she had gotten there. David Collins, the man with the red pickup truck, began losing entire days. His family would find him sitting in his truck in his driveway, unable to remember anything about the previous 24 hours. Margaret Foster stopped leaving her house altogether after she lost a complete weekend and woke up Monday morning with no memory of what she had done for 2 entire days. And Robert Martinez, the retired teacher, started experiencing memory loss episodes that lasted for weeks. His family had to place him in a care facility when they realized he was having more missing time than conscious time. The memory loss was getting worse, affecting people more frequently and for longer periods. But the most terrifying discovery came when we realized that people weren't just losing their memories. They were living entire alternate lives during their missing time periods. David Collins' family started finding evidence that he had been conducting complex activities during his memory loss episodes. His truck had been driven hundreds of miles, using gas and accumulating wear that indicated extensive travel. His bank account showed withdrawals and purchases that he couldn't remember making. His cell phone contained calls and text messages that he had no recollection of sending or receiving. Margaret Foster's family found that she had been cleaning her house thoroughly, organizing closets, and completing household projects during her missing weekends. But she had no memory of doing any of that work. Robert Martinez's family discovered that he had been writing detailed journals during his memory loss episodes. Pages and pages of handwritten notes about his daily activities, his thoughts and feelings, his plans for the future. But when he read the journals during his conscious periods, he had no memory of writing them and couldn't understand why the handwriting was his, but the thoughts and experiences described were completely unfamiliar. People were living parallel lives during their missing time periods, conducting complex activities and making decisions that their conscious minds knew nothing about. And the most disturbing part was that the activities they conducted during their memory loss episodes were often completely inconsistent with their normal personalities and behavior patterns. David Collins, a quiet accountant who rarely traveled and preferred to stay home with his family, had apparently driven his truck to distant cities during his missing time periods, visiting places he had never expressed any interest in seeing. Margaret Foster, a meticulous housekeeper who maintained an organized home, had apparently rearranged all her furniture and belongings in ways that made no sense to her conscious mind. Robert Martinez, a retired English teacher who wrote carefully and thoughtfully, had filled his journals with rambling, stream-of-consciousness passages that bore no resemblance to his normal writing style. It was as if different personalities were taking control of their bodies during the memory loss episodes, personalities with different interests, different behaviors, and different ways of thinking. But the most chilling discovery came when we started analyzing the patterns of activity during the memory loss episodes. All of the affected people were conducting activities that seemed to be preparing for something. David Collins had been stocking his truck with supplies, food, water, tools, camping equipment. Margaret Foster had been organizing her house as if preparing for a long absence. Robert Martinez had been writing detailed instructions and procedures for activities he had never shown any interest in. It was as if their alternate personalities knew something was coming, something that required preparation and planning. And then, 6 months after the memory loss episodes began, everyone in the affected area disappeared completely. On a Tuesday morning in March, emergency services received reports that the entire 3-mile area around Main Street and County Road 7 was empty. Houses stood open with breakfast still on kitchen tables. Cars were parked in driveways with engines running. Businesses were open but completely abandoned. Over 300 people had vanished without a trace, leaving behind evidence of normal morning routines that had been interrupted mid-activity. Search and rescue teams found no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence, no indication that people had been forced to leave their homes. It appeared that everyone in the affected area had simply stopped what they were doing and walked away, leaving everything behind. The missing people were never found. Despite extensive searches involving local, state, and federal agencies, despite investigations that continued for months, despite rewards and publicity campaigns, none of the 300 missing residents of Millfield Township were ever located. The area where they had lived remained empty. No one would move into the abandoned houses. No one would operate the empty businesses. No one would even drive through the area unless absolutely necessary. Because everyone who spent time in that area started experiencing memory loss episodes, and eventually they disappeared too. The memory loss was spreading, affecting a larger area each month, claiming more people each year. But before I could transfer away from Millfield Township, I experienced one final episode that revealed the true horror of what was happening to our community. It occurred during what would be my last patrol shift in the affected area, and it showed me things that I wish I could forget. Things that made me understand why the missing people had been preparing so carefully during their alternate lives. I was conducting a routine evening patrol when I found myself responding to a call I didn't remember receiving. According to my patrol log, I had been dispatched to investigate reports of unusual activity at the abandoned Millfield Elementary School, which had been closed for 5 years due to declining enrollment. Unit 89 to dispatch. I'm on scene at Millfield Elementary. The building appears to be occupied despite being officially abandoned. Multiple vehicles in the parking lot. Lights visible throughout the structure. But I had no memory of making that radio transmission or arriving at the elementary school. The first thing I consciously remembered was standing in the school's main hallway, surrounded by all the missing residents of Millfield Township. Mrs. Harrison was there, along with David Collins, Margaret Foster, Robert Martinez, and hundreds of other people who had vanished over the past 6 months. They were all engaged in purposeful activities, organizing supplies, setting up equipment, preparing what appeared to be some kind of permanent settlement within the abandoned school building. But the most disturbing aspect of the scene wasn't seeing all the missing people alive and well. It was realizing that they all looked at me with recognition and familiarity, as if I had been working alongside them for months. "Steve, did you finish checking the perimeter security?" Mrs. Harrison asked, speaking to me as if we had been having an ongoing conversation. "The supply inventory is complete," David Collins reported. "We have enough resources to sustain the community for at least 18 months. "The communication systems are operational," Margaret Foster announced. "We're receiving signals from 17 other locations across 6 states. I stood there in complete confusion, unable to understand how these people were talking to me as if I was part of their community, part of whatever they had been building during their missing time. That's when Robert Martinez approached me with a thick notebook filled with detailed plans and diagrams. "Steve, you helped us design the expansion protocols. Don't you remember? We've been working on this together for months during your alternate shifts." He opened the notebook to reveal pages of handwritten plans in my own handwriting, detailed procedures for expanding their operation to new geographic areas, strategies for recruiting additional people, and technical specifications for equipment I had never seen before. According to the notebook, I had been living an alternate life during my memory loss episodes, working as a key organizer in whatever the missing people were preparing. The handwriting was definitely mine, but the knowledge and expertise demonstrated in the plans were completely beyond my normal capabilities. The schedule shows that tonight is your transition night, Mrs. Harrison explained. After this shift, you won't need to return to your old life anymore. You'll be able to stay here permanently with full memory integration. That's when I realized what was really happening. The memory loss episodes weren't random neurological events. They were a gradual process of transitioning people from their normal lives into this alternate community. Each episode allowed them to contribute to the project while their conscious minds remained unaware of what they were doing. The missing people hadn't disappeared. They had completed their transition and were now living permanently in their alternate reality, using abandoned buildings and hidden locations to build a parallel society that existed alongside but separate from the normal world. And according to the plans in my own handwriting, they were systematically expanding their operation, creating new zones of influence in communities across multiple states, gradually recruiting more people through the memory loss process. We know this is confusing for your conscious mind, David Collins said gently, but your alternate self has been preparing for this moment for months. All the knowledge and memories you need are already inside your mind. You just need to let them surface. I felt a strange, pulling sensation, as if part of my consciousness was trying to merge with memories and experiences I couldn't access. For a moment, I could almost remember being part of their community, working on their projects, contributing to their plans for expansion. But my training as a police officer kicked in, and I forced myself to focus on the reality I could understand and verify. What is this place? What are you people doing here, and why can't anyone remember choosing to be part of this? Steve, you did choose this, Margaret Foster said. Your alternate self made the choice after seeing what we're building here. A community free from the conflicts and problems of the outside world, where people can live in harmony and work toward the common goals. But you're stealing people's lives, taking away their families, their identities, their freedom to choose. We're offering people a better life, Robert Martinez explained. Look around you. Everyone here is healthy, productive, and fulfilled. No crime, no violence, no suffering, just purpose and community. I looked around the converted school building and realized they were right about one thing. Everyone appeared to be genuinely happy and content. They were working together on complex projects with enthusiasm and cooperation I had rarely seen in normal society. But they had achieved this harmony by essentially kidnapping people's consciousness, by gradually replacing their normal lives with alternate versions they couldn't remember choosing. The expansion is accelerating, Mrs. Harrison said, checking a complex chart on the wall. We now have active zones in 43 communities across 12 states. The process is becoming more efficient as we refine our methods. And law enforcement, I asked. What happens to police officers like me who discover what you're doing? Law enforcement personnel are particularly valuable to our operation, David Collins explained. Your alternate self has been instrumental in helping us avoid detection and manage the transition process. Police officers who join us help ensure that missing person investigations are handled in ways that don't interfere with our recruitment activities. That's when I understood the full scope of what was happening. They weren't just stealing individual lives, they were systematically infiltrating law enforcement agencies, using police officers' alternate selves to cover up their activities and prevent effective investigation of the disappearances. How many missing person cases had been mishandled by officers who were unconsciously protecting this parallel community? How many investigations had been misdirected by cops who were living double lives they couldn't remember? "Steve, it's time for your final transition," Robert Martinez said, approaching me with some kind of electronic device. "After tonight, you won't need to struggle with conflicting memories anymore. You'll be able to remember both lives and choose which reality you prefer." I realized that whatever they were planning to do to me would complete my transformation into one of them. After tonight, I would either fully join their community or be eliminated as a threat to their operation. "I need some time to think about this," I said, backing toward the exit. "This is a lot to process." "Of course," Mrs. Harrison said understandingly. "Your alternate self anticipated that your conscious mind would need time to adjust. We'll give you until midnight to make your decision." I managed to get out of the school building and back to my patrol car, but I knew they would be watching me closely. They had apparently been preparing for this moment for months, and they were confident that I would ultimately choose to join them permanently. I drove directly to the state police barracks and reported everything I had discovered, but I knew it might already be too late. If they had infiltrating officers in multiple law enforcement agencies, my report might never reach anyone who could take effective action. 3 hours later, I was on a bus heading to another state, carrying only the clothes I was wearing, and a determination never to spend another night in a place where I might lose control of my own mind. But even now, 2 years later, working patrol in a community hundreds of miles from Millfield Township, I sometimes hear my own voice on the police radio making transmissions I don't remember. I sometimes find notes in my own handwriting describing activities I can't recall performing. The memory loss is spreading, following me wherever I go, gradually expanding its influence to new communities and new victims. And I know that someday I'll lose enough time that I won't remember how to resist anymore. Someday, my alternate self will complete the transition, and I'll join the parallel society that exists in the missing hours between conscious thoughts. The scanner crackles with voices every night. Dispatchers, officers, emergency personnel. Most of those voices belong to people who remember making the transmissions. But some of those voices belong to people who are living parallel lives they'll never remember, building a hidden world they'll never consciously choose to join, until the day they lose enough time to forget why they ever wanted to resist. The voices that remind me that consciousness is more fragile than we think. The voices that taught me that free will is more limited than we believe. The voices that are still out there, broadcasting from the missing hours where stolen minds build a society that grows stronger with every person who loses track of time.